Order. Mike Hill to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Graham, and it's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition number 233926 relating to knife crime. The petition, which was created by Mr John Perrins, has attracted 104,271 signatures and specifically calls for people found with a knife to get 10 years and using a knife 25 years in prison. Sir Graham, at the beginning of this speech, I would like to pay my respects to all victims of knife crimes and their grieving families. As we know from the tragic murders of 17-year-old Jodie Chesney in London and 17-year-old Yusuf Maki in Manchester, the victims are more often than not younger people, and that knife crime is often associated with that demographic. But I would also like to take the opportunity to pay my respects to the family of Kelly Franklin, who was stabbed to death aged just 29 on August the 3rd last year in Hartlepool. The government responded to the petition on the 14th of March 2019, stating in particular that conviction of a knife crime or offensive weapon offence, threatening or possession, is now more likely to result in some form of custodial sentence, and for longer than at any point in the last 10 years. They go on to say, in 2015, we introduced minimal custodial sentences for repeat knife possession and offences that involve threatening with a weapon. Adults face a minimum of 6 months imprisonment, while young people aged 16 or 17 face a minimum 4-month detention and training order since the introduction of the minimal custodial term. People caught carrying a knife or offensive weapon for a second time are now more likely than ever before to go to prison. In the year ending September 2018, 82% of offenders received a custodial sentence for repeat possession offences. These offences carry maximum terms of 4 years imprisonment. Sir Graham, the statistics on knife crime for this year alone speak volumes. We are only in March, and yet there have been 39 fatal stabbings in Britain since the beginning of this year. 3 more since last Friday, including another 17-year-old. So, give way.
I thank the honourable member for my honourable friend for bringing this debate, and also congratulate John Perrins for organising the petition and for all those who signed it. The 17-year-old died in my constituency in Isleworth on Friday night after a rising spike of violent attacks in Isleworth. And would the honourable member not agree with me that whilst there may be a place for stronger sentences, there is a lot that all agencies can do, and funding is needed for schools, for youth provision, for police support and so on?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I come to those points later. The Ministry of Justice figures released last week also show that 21,484 people, including 4,686 here in the capital, were prosecuted or cautioned for knife offences in England and Wales last year. That's 2,000 up on 2016, 5,000 more than in 2013, and the highest number of arrests and prosecutions since 2009. No wonder people are beginning to describe the current situation as an epidemic. Whether or not they would agree with that description, the government have had to concede there is a problem. Only last week in his spring statement, the Chancellor announced that the government will award police forces an extra £100 million over the next year to pay for overtime and support knife and violent crime reductions. Give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way and for making such a significant start to his debate. Would my friend agree with me that in terms of investing funds in the police is good and well-meaning, but actually investment needs to take place in other areas, such as in youth services, schools, in the councils, but also in building relationships with parents and working with parents with their young people?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend there. In fact, part of the petitions debate system is to do outreach work. And on Friday last, we went to a local school in Hartlepool where the young people repeated much of that argument. Many will agree that this is too little too late and make comparisons between £100 million and the £2.7 billion taken out of the policing system since 2010. But any money specifically targeted to tackling and preventing knife crime is welcome. For the record, I have to say that my own police force, Cleveland Police, has seen the numbers of police officers reduced by 500, which is a 37% reduction in staffing, following cuts of £25.5 million since 2010. Sir Graham, the Prime Minister may be of the opinion that there is no correlation between police cuts and knife crime, but senior figures in the policing community like Cressida Dick disagree. And when you consider that officer ranks across England have been depleted by 20,000, it's a small wonder that people are making the link. The net results of the effects of police cuts was writ large when my constituency of Hartlepool became the focus of a BBC film broadcast on the national news, where it was exposed that for a town with a population of 92,028 at the last census, there were only 10 police officers on duty on a Saturday night. Such a lack of visible police on the streets, as exposed by the film, has resulted in our communities feeling less safe and under threat. There is a real perception that crime levels will rise unless the police are better resourced. Cleveland Police last year saw an increase in knife crime cautions or convictions from the previous year and a 4% rise since 2015. The Police and Crime Commissioner, Barry Coppinger, is doing a lot of excellent work on crime prevention and intervention, but without the resources, he is swimming against the tide. Sir Graham, there truly is an argument, not only to better resource the police, but to increase the tariff on custodial sentences. Current tariffs are clearly not sufficient to act as a deterrent to criminals in the mind of the public, and the petition before us reflects that opinion. The fact that the maximum penalty of 4 years applies only to re-offenders, not even first offenders, is deeply worrying.
Thank you for giving and for speaking so well and pleasure to speak under Chair. Families in my constituency who have suffered the tragedy of losing a loved one to knife crime have said that witnesses have not come forward as a direct result of the failure or the lack of confidence in seeing lengthy convictions for those who commit the crime. So do you agree that the aims behind this petition would help address that concern and deliver longer sentences and give witnesses and a better chance of securing prosecutions overall?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and if anything, the petition opens up a debate around that whole subject, including prevention. It may be that the call by the petition for mandatory tariffs of 10 years for possession and 25 years for use of a knife is seen to be excessive, but there can be no doubt that in the mind of the general public that the courts need to play their part in preventing this proliferation in knife-related criminal activity. And frankly, the murders occurring on our streets day in and day out. So, right?
Thank you. I congratulate the honourable gentleman for making a very good speech. I was just going to say that I completely understand the need, the kind of feeling that there is in the public, and I hear it myself many times, for longer sentencing. But in 2015, the government brought in a two strikes policy, meaning that anyone over 18 who's caught twice gets a minimum 6-month jail term. But despite those changes, knife crime has rocketed. So you've seen the number of people being put into prison for knife offences go up at exactly the same angle as the number of people who've actually committed knife offences. So it hasn't had any impact at all in terms of being a deterrent.
I agree, and I thank my friend for her contributions as chair of the APPG on knife crime, and you're absolutely correct there. That we need to find some real solutions, but I go back to my earlier phrase that the demographic in the increase in knife crimes tends to be under 18-year-olds. So there really does need to be a rethink about custodial and preventative measures.
Just on that point,
brief way?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I congratulate him? You are making a really incredible and impactful speech. But we're talking about harsher sentences. And does he agree with me that that doesn't always act as a deterrent, the harsher sentence, and that we do need to focus on so many more of the drivers that lead our young people into a life of crime? So in many respects, for some of them, it's through sheer desperation or pressure and so many other factors. So prevention is key to this and looking at those drivers.
Thank the Honourable Member for her contribution. And again, I thank the young students at English Martyr School in Hartlepool, because they came out with the exact same argument. The lack of youth services, for example, poor mental health availability. Interestingly, ideas that young girls, two of which actually witnessed the display of knives in Hartlepool, were concerned about sexual assault as well as the use of weapons. So yes, you're absolutely right. We need to focus on those areas of prevention and understanding exactly where this problem has arisen. So, Sir Graham, in concluding my speech, I would like to pay tribute to the staff of the Petitions Committee who've engaged in educational and outreach work around this subject, and as I've mentioned twice now, for the input of the students from the English Martyr School in Hartlepool for adding their voices and opinions to this debate. Thank you.
Now, before I put the question, if I can just remind members present that they should address each other in the third person. So anybody who says you is talking to me, and I don't think that was what was intended. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 233926 relating to knife crime. Andrew Rossendale.
Thank you, Sir Graham, and may I begin by commending the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for bringing this debate to Westminster Hall today. We are, I think all of us in this room are affected in some way by what seems to be an epidemic of knife crime, particularly those of us in Greater London. So I share the horror that others will express in this debate today and that the Honourable Member for Hartlepool has articulated so well. And I know that everyone here in the House this afternoon will be united in grief at the recent tragic events that we have seen, particularly the devastating murder of 17-year-old Jodie Chesney that took place in Harold Hill, which is part of the London Borough of Havering, but is under the Hornchurch and Upminster constituency, represented by my honourable friend. But it is my neighbouring constituency, and Harold Hill is actually considered by most people to be part of Romford, and so therefore the Honourable Member for Hornchurch and Upminster and myself are working together and united in fighting against this horrendous attack on that innocent young girl and to bring the whole community together. And that's what has happened in our area. The whole community has come together in unity in working to eradicate this awful attack on what was an innocent young girl sitting in a park on her own or with friends. She had done nothing wrong, but she was brutally murdered, and this has had a huge effect on our community. And so my heart, and I know the hearts of everyone in this room, will go out to Jodie's family and her friends today and in the future. And I wear this purple ribbon in her memory. It was her favourite colour, and if any of you happen to be passing through the London Borough of Havering, you will notice these ribbons are tied to trees and lampposts on fences, and it is really a huge mark of how it's affected our community. And so I say to the Honourable Member for Hartlepool, today's debate really means a great deal to all the people from Havering who have gone through a terrible trauma in the last few weeks. So while this debate was secured by worried citizens all over the country, it is telling, as I've described, that the biggest proportion of those signing the petition came from the 3 constituencies within the London Borough of Havering, my own of Romford, Hornchurch and Upminster, and Dagenham and Rainham. And when I raised this very issue several weeks ago with the Prime Minister in a private meeting here in her office in the House of Commons, she rightly highlighted that the law already provides for mandatory prison sentencing for a second offence of carrying a knife, and a conviction of a knife or offensive weapon is now more likely to result in some form of custodial sentence. And the honourable member made that very point himself, more likely than we've seen in recent years. And yet, Sir Graham, if we look at the figures, they reveal why the public still have no faith, or very little faith, in our justice system over this. As it stands, 2/3 of those carrying a knife escape a custodial sentence, and 1 in 5 repeat offenders avoid prison. People are quite frankly fed up with the soft sentencing, and it is quite clear why. In my borough of Havering, knife offences have actually doubled in recent years, since 2014, with 333 recorded cases last year alone. And we are an outer London borough. We may be a greater London borough, but if anyone ever comes to Havering, you will know that we are really Essex, and we're on the outer edges of London. And so this kind of crime we hear about in city centres, but in areas like ours, we're unused to it, and it's come as a terrible shock that this is coming out to areas like mine, and indeed further afield. And so such is the desperation felt by local residents that people in my area have established a community group, and this is called Take a Knife, Save a Life. This is founded by local people from across the London Borough of Havering. Completely independent group of local people who are now patrolling the streets and local parks, talking to young people, spending time with them, trying to understand, what's in their minds, and also giving them an opportunity to hand over any knives or offensive weapons they may have anonymously. So it just shows how people are so desperate to do something that there isn't the police cover that we want or expect, and so they are taking things into their own hands, but in a law-abiding way. And so to some, and I'm sure some will think that this is dangerous, but it is, Sir Graham, no longer sufficient to merely request the public to be more vigilant. More work must be done to tackle these criminals who simply have no respect for the law or authority or the local communities in which they live. This is not just an issue of funding and numbers, but police policy too. I know that most people in my constituency in Romford favour a much more robust approach to dealing with violent criminals. We now have gang culture and youths coming from outside Havering, causing fear on our streets. It has come to a point where the Metropolitan Police Violent Crime Reduction Unit will have to come to Havering, as confirmed by my recent meeting with Sophie Linden, the Deputy Mayor of Policing for London. And I'm glad that the government's push for knife crime prevention orders is taking place, and I do believe that serious violence strategy is a step in the right direction, but this has to be a collective effort. In London, it's no good blaming just the Mayor of London. I can criticise him, but I'm not today because this is too serious. It's no good just criticising the government, and I will criticise them. I disagree with some of the comments that the Prime Minister has made that cutting police has no effect on crime. I disagree with that, and frankly, nobody out there believes that either. So it's no good making this a political football. This affects all of our constituencies and all of our communities, and we have to work together with the local communities to find solutions. I certainly will.
I thank him very much for giving way, and I like the points that he is making. But does he feel, as he may have heard my urgent question in the urgent question on knife crime, that we as MPs actually have a positive role to play in this rather than just being observers? And does he agree with me that my request to the Minister to come up with giving us the information to be able to do things like he has described in getting community groups together to be able to take that sort of action on the streets is a very useful thing?
I do. I thank my honourable friend for making that comment, because I think we all have a all of us have a duty to our communities, and we are community leaders. And so I'm working with local groups to fight crime. We don't have a magic wand, we don't have a solution directly, but we can play a part. And I certainly commend all those youth organisations and church groups, particularly faith organisations, that are taking a lead in that, the street pastors, youth groups, the scouts, and tragically Jodie was an explorer scout, which was even more highlighted how terrible this crime was. So yes, the community and MPs have a leadership role in this. It's not just down to the police, it's not just down to social workers, it's not just down to youth workers. We all have a part to play. And so, Sir Graham, these crime prevention orders were requested directly from the police and favour a dual approach of tough measures and positive early interventions. And this is why I often stress, and do so again today, the importance of community policing. When police are based in the communities where police know and understand the community like the back of their hand, as I'm sure we do as constituency MPs, and more importantly as well, the community get to know them and become familiar with them, familiar faces, policemen in their communities every day of the week. They build trust and recognition, and that grows in the local area. And I think that brings people together, they trust their local police, and that helps to bring crime to a halt, or at least curtail that crime. If I could just finish this point, and I certainly will come to the Honourable Lady, and this is what I want to make a very serious point, particularly about in Greater London. Neighbourhood police are best placed to make interventions to protect residents when it is community-based. Yet, despite my attempts to make this point over and over again during my 18 years as Member of Parliament for Romford in this House, I still see outdated models for policing and resources, not based around real communities, which it should be, but based around bureaucratic electoral ward boundaries on a map that bear no relation to actual communities. They're just an electoral number. And this is crazy. This doesn't make any sense. So communities are divided up between police teams instead of based on true natural communities. You have lines in a road where one police team will go to that side of the road, but not that side of the road because they're different wards. Wards are not the way to fight crime. Criminals do not base crime on ward boundaries. Their actions can go anywhere, and therefore the police should police communities on that basis as well. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
The Honourable Member is making a valid point about the rigidity of ward boundaries, and that's why, certainly in West London, we welcome the new BCU set-up, has grouped the neighbourhood teams into town base and bringing several wards together in a more logical way under a single sergeant, and that I welcome. But would the Honourable Member not agree that I absolutely agree with his points about the importance and value of neighbourhood teams, but would he not agree that the numbers of people in them is important, and that we have lost the strength of those neighbourhood teams by roughly half in Hounslow, from 5 per ward to 3 and a bit per ward? And would you not agree that that is regrettable and due to the cuts that the government have imposed on the Metropolitan Police?
Well, can I say that I do agree, and I've made it clear a moment ago, that I don't agree with what was said by the Prime Minister, that cutting police has no link to crime. So I agree with the Honourable Lady on that. Where I don't want to get you into a battle today is over resources from government, or whether it's Sadiq Khan not allocating enough as he should be and all the rest of it. We can argue that, but today's not a day for that. Today is a day, I hope we can agree, that both government and the Mayor have a duty to allocate as much resources as is possible to fighting crime, particularly in inner city areas and areas in outer London as well, where crime now is rising and where we've seen only recently. So I think we should work together on this, because the public are losing patience. If we just turn this into political football, they won't thank us, frankly. They want all of us to work together. And that's why my idea about getting rid of bureaucratic, inflexible ward boundaries and actually creating proper community police that are understandable. And I did raise this with Sophie Linden the week before last, and unfortunately she didn't say she would go down. I said, well, can Havering be an experiment for that at least? And she didn't agree, so I am disappointed at that. But I do think we need to look at ways to channel resources to the best effect possible, certainly.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I agree that we need to look across politics to find the solutions. And can I just ask him to look at what some of the organisations are saying about the knife crime prevention orders? Because there is a big concern amongst the magistrates community, the lawyers, the youth offending teams, a lot of the charities. In fact, I haven't found a single organisation that thinks they're a good thing, that they could be a replacement for ASBOs, which the Prime Minister, you know, got rid of when she was the Home Secretary, and because actually they won't work, and you could end up putting 12-year-olds in prison for having committed no crime whatsoever. And I think, whilst I agree with the intent, but would the honourable gentleman perhaps look at the detail about whether actually we need to do a bit more work on those before we bring them to our streets?
I will certainly do that, but I'm sure the Minister could respond to that in his closing remarks at the end of this debate. But it's important whatever mechanism we use, it's going to be effective and it's not going to be counterproductive. And so I think that is certainly something we all need to consider. So, Sir Graham, I would also like to highlight the great success of the Scotland Violence Reduction Unit. This has halved the murder rate in a 10-year period, and members will know that it worked closely with partners such as the NHS, education and social workers. However, this was also taken in conjunction with a no-nonsense approach to those who cross the line, and I think that is what we need. There is something I hope we can replicate here in Greater London. And so low-level offences must be policed and proactively to challenge the culture of criminality and antisocial behaviour. This is why supporting the police isn't just about resourcing, it's also about making sure that they have the powers to get on with the job and be effective on the ground. I get deeply worried, as I'm sure honourable members in this House do too, when I hear from constituents that they believe that low-level crime, such as shoplifting and burglary, no longer get taken as seriously as they should by the police. I'd like to say today that the announcement of the Offensive Weapons Bill last year, which is making it harder for young people to buy knives and acid online, is very good. However, the public are wary of legislation which provides a tough narrative but minimal action to those violent offenders who will simply be more innovative in their access to dangerous weapons. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for Romford and to my honourable friend for Middlesbrough on the conduct of this debate, which has been very positive. I'm sure, Sir Graham, that the honourable gentleman is right to concentrate for much of his speech on police resources and how the police are organised and sentencing. And he did touch a moment ago on what happened in Glasgow. Will he agree with me that in addition to a proper police resourcing and sentencing, it's necessary also to interrupt the activities of organised crime, which often, through the drugs industry, sit behind this rise in knife crime, and at the same time for there to be diversionary activities for those young people who are vulnerable to falling into that trap. And all of that does take resources.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and a lot of the crime, the root of it is this. There is a drug culture, a gang culture. I mean, the honourable member is not a London MP, but I think in London we're seeing this right across, but I'm sure in other parts of the country there are similar cultures building. And as I said on Daily Politics yesterday, on the London section, we have to crush this culture. And it doesn't matter what community or town or borough we come from, this culture has to be crushed. Young people, if they get into that culture, it leads to these incidents and violence happening, and it ruins lives. And so, you know, we really do have to get underneath this problem and ensure that it is curtailed and stopped in the future. And so, while the serious violence strategy will deliver, I hope will deliver on its promise to provide more funds for such activities, I believe that we must provide law-giving powers to tackle this issue. The policies we put in place for knife crime prevention must not simply paper over the cracks. I frequently request updates from Operation Venice from my local police, which is the operation launched to tackle moped-related crime. Naturally, I sought clarification whether it was true that police were not giving chase to suspects on two-wheeled vehicles. And I received countless reports from my constituents that police were not being allowed to do their job and apprehend these hooligans. I was dumbfounded, I have to say, to the Minister, by the ensuing blame game that took place over this. The government said guidance is provided by the College of Policing, yet police on the ground simply didn't have the comfort in the protections given to them. Eventually, I would have to say, sense did prevail, and last November, a massive crackdown on moped thieves took place who were regularly threatening innocent people, alongside new confidence given to the police on using tactical contacts. The media covered the new approach widely. The result is that we have now seen moped-enabled crimes in the capital fall by 47% in the space of a few months. So a strategy like that shows that you can tackle crime where it is evolving and getting out of control. A strategy can be put in place and it can be knocked on the head. And so a similar, much more radical strategy, I think, is needed to tackle knife crime in London. Certainly.
Honourable Member from Romford for giving way. Obviously, when we're talking about a knife crime with young people, we're obviously talking about people that are obviously often quite vulnerable. And one of the things that the Honourable Member mentioned was getting underneath the problem. And in some cases, the problem is very much due to coercion, bullying, threats, why some young people get involved with carrying knives. Would the Honourable Member agree with that point?
Oh, I do agree with that point, and I think that there needs to be a restoration of police in schools. I mean, there are still police going into schools, but nothing like what there used to be. That's been reduced, and I think that I have to say, stop and search is something that I fully support, and my constituents fully support. I don't think any law-abiding person need fear. We all get stopped and searched at the airport. Members of the public get stopped and searched when they come in here. And I think that when you're seeing knife crime in our communities, I think it's a thing, provided the police show respect and do it in a way that does not offend people. I'm sure the police are able to do this, and I think that if they do, then knives can be found and confiscated, and that will make our community safer. So if I could, yes, certainly.
Thank you for giving way. And I'm glad to hear his support for Operation Venice, which has had incredible results in my own constituency as well. And I totally support the Honourable Member's call for greater action on this issue across the board. The Prime Minister suggested last week that the issue of Brexit was blocking Parliament taking action on NHS, education and knife crime issues. Does he agree with me that that premise is not acceptable? It's not an either-or for any government. Knife crime has to be acted upon. And having met with the Prime Minister, as he's already outlined, when does he expect further action to come forward?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak for the Prime Minister. I'm sure the Minister can speak for the government later. But I don't, whatever's going on with Brexit, that cannot be an excuse for doing nothing over this. And it doesn't necessarily require legislation. It requires strategies. It requires more resources. It requires communities working together. And I think that a lot can be done without necessarily having to pass new laws. However, in this particular instance, we are talking about increasing the penalties for carrying and using a knife, and I am totally in favour of that. And I can tell you that there isn't a single constituent in my area, and I'm sure my honourable friend from Interdepartmental will have the same experience, that actually feels that the current penalties are sufficient. They want to see much tougher action, much stricter penalties, and a real deterrent so that people fear being caught and fear being apprehended and imprisoned for a long time if they carry and use a knife. And so, if I could just return to my comments. Stopping low-level disorder and petty crime does help to curtail the invitation to more serious crime, and that is why knife crime prevention orders, I hope, will help. Yet we must not turn away from difficult questions. My constituents are particularly fortunate that Havering starts from a base of historically low crime, and they want to keep it that way. As legislators, we cannot throw money at a problem and expect that will solve everything. No questions are asked and no reforms are required. That is not simply the answer. More needs to be done. We must smash the myth that carrying a knife is a normal thing to do on some estates. And we should take a long, hard look at compulsory custodial sentences for knife crimes. And I hope the Minister will address this later. Law-abiding citizens fearful of their children when they walk home from school or simply relax in a park with friends, are sick of seeing soft sentences for knife crime offenders. And I therefore call on Her Majesty's Government to urgently consider a minimum custodial sentence for knife and offensive weapon offences. What do you say to a parent of a victim who, in despair at the cautions handed down to the perpetrators of these horrifying crimes? How have we arrived at a stage where a man who tried to smash a car window and attack an individual with a huge zombie knife in broad daylight is given a suspended sentence? The Minister needs to ask himself, how can these kind of sentences be justified? The decision was only overturned after public outrage, and appeal judges overturned this notoriously lenient sentence with jail time. Legislators and the courts are at risk of becoming detached from public opinion on which is fast becoming a national crisis. We in this place have a duty, Sir Graham, to ensure that an effective deterrent exists to combat this evil culture and do everything in our power to stop more young people from being slaughtered in our communities. We must now take action and, in so doing, honour the memory of Jodie Chesney.
And Coker.
Thank you very much, Sir Graham. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate my honourable friend for Hartlepool as well for his introduction to the debate. Let me just start with this and get this out of the way, Sir Graham. I do think there's an issue about police resources and the numbers of police. I do think there's an issue about the cuts that have been to local authority services and youth services, but we'll leave that for another day. But I don't want people to, because there is a debate about that, and we shouldn't forget that. And I just say gently to the honourable member about neighbourhood policing. There used to be huge numbers of neighbourhoods with large numbers of community police officers, neighbourhood police officers, backed by police staff, and that made a huge difference. But in order to try to take this forward, Sir Graham, as to where we are, I just say to the Minister, as I've said countless times over the last few months, as honourable members, my honourable friends and other honourable members will have heard me, this is a national crisis. I mean, it's a national emergency. If it were any other type of national emergency, irrespective of what else was going on, the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary or the Secretary of State for Justice would be at the House of Commons, at the dispatch box, day after day after day, outlining what had happened and what the government were doing about it. That's why I called a few weeks ago for it to be treated like terrorism, not to underestimate terrorism or to decry the importance of us having to deal with that, but just to give that sense of urgency to it. And we drift on, frankly, Sir Graham. The Prime Minister, I think my honourable friend made this, was alluding to this point, the Prime Minister nearly 3 weeks ago promised a knife crime summit. 3 weeks ago, nearly, at the dispatch box. We are now told that will take place next week, sometime next week. I say to every honourable member that in the face of a national emergency, a month, as it will be, is simply and utterly unacceptable and will be bewildering to the people of this country. Virtually, certainly 2 or 3 times a week, 3 or 4 times a week, across the country, not just in London, people are killed, horrifically. And we have to do something about it. And we have to speak up and speak out more about it. It absolutely is astonishing that the House of Commons chamber does not reverberate with the roar of MPs demanding action from the government. The government will say, we're doing this and we're doing that. But what the public doesn't see, and I don't feel, and I think the honourable member was saying that, and certainly my honourable friend was, where's the urgency? Where's the passion? Where's the anger? Where's the desire to get hold of this? I've said as well, and people say it's ridiculous, but I see the former Prime Minister Tony Blair actually said it this morning, Cobra should meet about this. Why should it meet? Because what is lacking, irrespective of the amount of resources, is that coordination across government. And I'll say something about sentencing in a minute to illustrate what I mean. But of course it's not just about police numbers. Of course not. That's ridiculous. But I tell you what, a long-term public health plan won't stop somebody being stabbed tonight. The thing that will stop that is police resources and increased police presence on the ground. That isn't the answer overall, of course not. But in the short term, that's where you have to go. So the increase the Chancellor announced will help. Let me also say this to this committee and to this Parliament. In the government's own evidence, in the serious violence strategy, it shows, as does the leaked memo from the Home Office, I know we've got the Justice Minister here, that actually hotspot policing actually reduces knife crime. Evidentially based. And also what it does, Sir Graham, is it does not displace that to areas alongside it. It stops it. Because it actually tackles the people who are committing those offences. But look, am I lock them up and throw the key away? Of course not. All I'm saying is in the short term, where we've lost control, there isn't an alternative. In the short term. But where are the intervention measures, the prevention measures before? Where are the youth clubs gone? Where are the street workers? The honourable member was quite right. The most effective, when I was the police minister, the most effective people on the street, alongside police officers, were street pastors. There are countless other examples of that, and I tell you who the most effective street pastors were, the older street pastors. And they stopped stupid incidents outside shops or in a precinct, stupid kids in their stupid gangs having an issue between them where somebody's looked at somebody or bumped into their bike, for Christ's sake, and a stabbing in it. They get involved with it and stop it happening before it becomes something. And that sounds almost pathetic in the face of the huge rises in knife crime. But actually that worked and made a difference. So, I just say to the Minister, what I would love the Minister to do is to say he recognises, and the Justice Department recognises, and I'll come to sentencing in a minute, that government has to more effectively coordinate what is happening across government rather than the individual compartmentalised elements of it, and have an urgency, as the Minister will when he reflects on other things that I've seen him do, bring that urgency to dealing with this particular problem. Yeah, of course.
Frank, give way. He's making an excellent series of points, and that was what I was hoping that we would cover in this debate, that it's the sort of breakdown of the fabric of society that is all part of this as well. You can't just point to one thing, such as the police, the 21,000 shortage of police, but it is also things that have happened in schools, the number of exclusions, unofficial exclusions that are happening, kids out on the streets, and the lack of youth provision, all the preventative stuff. So all of it taken in the round, and it could be under the word austerity. And does he agree that that has had an effect, and this could be the consequences of it?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, of course, and that's the point I'm making. It's not just policing. But in the short term, that's where you have to go. That's all I'm saying. It should never have got to this point, where you get the breakdown of all of that. Let me say a couple of other things to Graham, and this is true of justice or whatever. What the system doesn't do is look at what works. So if you take exclusions, kids not being in school, if we're talking about youth crime, actually does have an impact. It's just a no-brainer. You don't need a research project of millions of pounds. Everybody knows it. People on the street know it. Every single member of Parliament in here, everybody watching our proceedings will know that that has an effect. And so, but when I say, or others say, there is a real problem with how we deal with those young people, of course there are brilliant examples of pupil referral units, activity with young people excluded from school. But I tell you this, many of those young people disappear. Everybody's responsible, but nobody is. And that has to change. Otherwise, they just drift into a twilight zone. I will come to one of my friends in a minute. Drift into a twilight zone where they're exploited by criminals, or they're associated with these people who parade around on the estate saying, do you want to make some money? I'll show you how to make some money. Don't you listen to them. We know it goes on. We have to take that culture on. But we can't do it by being honest about it. My honourable friend's absolutely right. Proper provision of for excluded pupils, excluded young people, is absolutely fundamental. And some works and some doesn't. And we have to find a way of ensuring that good practice is spread much more widely than it is, of course.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and he's conducting this debate with his normal passion and insight. Would he agree with me? He's right to say what he said about exclusions from school and young people disappearing. There is another problem, however, and that is when some youngsters, because they're too much of a nuisance in school, are sent to alternative provision, some of which is very good, but some of it which is nothing more than very poor childminding, and we need to have urgent measures to look at what's going on in this country with alternative provision.
I agree with that, absolutely. And this is the point, again, for the Minister for Justice. The alternatives for prison or custodial sentences, the Minister will know, his own department will be reporting to him that some of those alternatives are frankly rubbish. Other alternatives are brilliant. Well, if we know what works, why aren't we replicating what works? Instead of supporting sometimes alternative provision outside of school, or indeed in some schools they provide it inside, where the Justice Department is funding those as an alternative to prison, why don't we ensure that those things that work, that prevent young people getting who've been excluded from school, why don't we just replicate that? And that requires, and frankly, I know this is not a fashionable thing to say, Sir Graham, in a time of localism. Let me say this. I think that localism is absolutely right. But you know, sometimes the government has to pick it up and drive it. The government has to pick it up and drive it. And I say, in this example, this would be one of the areas where I think the government should drive it forward. Let me say this, and again, the honourable member and my honourable friend made the point, and I'm sure others will make the point as well. The Minister has got a really tough job here. And let me say this. Why? If anybody who carries a knife, the public will say it's completely unacceptable and they should be jailed straight away. They will also say that. I'm not talking about the use of the knife, I'm talking about... the public will say, even if it's once, you shouldn't have a second chance when it comes to something as serious as this. Any government, including when we were in power, any government always puts on, and this is the bit of the mandatory sentencing that nobody reads. Every bit of legislation has a bit that says, of course, the court has a discretion to look at the particular circumstances. I say this to the Minister. Having been somebody who is appalled by repeat cautioning, is appalled by the fact that the courts seem, in many instances, to fail to act where there is persistent offending, even I can see, if you've got one idiotic lad who's 12 years old, that somebody stuffed a knife in their pocket, but he can't prove it was stuffed in his pocket by somebody else. You do have to sort of let the court try and find out whether he deliberately done that, or whether somebody had put the knife on him, or threatened he'd beat him up unless he put the knife on him. So I do, I do think we all have to be careful about saying, in every single circumstance, in every single case, the first time a pathetic girl or boy, it's because that's what they are, carries a knife, that in every single one of those circumstances they should be jailed forever and the key thrown away. And I accept that. But I tell you what I don't accept. The inability of the state, the inability of government, Sir Graham, to explain that to people. You know, to actually say, and everybody does it, everybody says, we're going to be tough, we're going to have mandatory sentencing, we're going to lock all of them up. And then, of course, that doesn't happen, because quite rightly in a democracy, we have the legal system and the independence of the judiciary. And the judiciary, including any of us if we were magistrates, would look at the circumstances of an individual case and say, do you know what, in this particular instance, I don't want to send them to where my honourable friend Fernozley was saying, I don't want to send them to somewhere like that. I think they deserve a chance. There are not many people in our Parliament who would not allow their courts that discretion. But what is wrong, and I just say this to the Minister, and this again is where the government should be shouting this, explain it, tell people. Don't hide behind the harshness of the rhetoric. Actually do what I've just done. And just explain that even in the face of a national emergency, in the face of a knife crime epidemic, there will be circumstances in which the courts will want to exercise a discretion. And, you know, the Minister's no doubt got that in his speech, in his notes, for the conclusion. But we should... But let me say, I have no idea, and this is where there is a problem. I'd like the Minister to comment on this. I'll finish in a moment, Mr. Sir Graham. What I'd like the Minister to do, in the legislation, it talks about mandatory sentence except in exceptional circumstances. What does that mean? I know, but the guidelines that the Minister is brandishing for us, Sir Graham, is not interpreted across the judicial system in a fair and concise and a way which is consistent between different... And it drives people mad, drives me mad. And that's what undermines the system. So let me finish with this. Alongside all of this that I've been discussing, sentencing by the courts is crucial. There has to be an expectation that people are jailed, whether they be adults, young adults, or older, whether they be young children or older children, or indeed adults. But it has to be more consistent. The figures the Honourable Gentleman gave cannot be right. It cannot be right that huge numbers of people are being cautioned again and again and again. It cannot be right that in between different courts, some people are going to jail and others aren't. It can't be right that nobody in the public properly understands what exceptional circumstances mean. That no minister has properly gone out there to articulate and explain that. And the Minister will have an opportunity when he wants that. Of course, yeah.
I'm very grateful for him giving way once again before he concludes. When I was chair of the all-party group for basketball, we did an inquiry into how basketball could be harnessed as a sport that appeals to, you know, certain demographics, inner city, high BAME participants, that the use of basketball could be used as a sentencing tool. And this might seem like a crazy idea, but actually there was evidence given by police and crime commissioners in Leicester and also in one of the London boroughs, I think it was the London borough of Newham, that were using something such as basketball to sort of sentence some of these young people who were at risk of perhaps being the ones to get into knife crime, to sort of find alternative provision. And basketball was one of the ones that was deemed would work. So much so that in the London Borough of Newham, there is an initiative called Carry a Ball, Not a Blade project. Does he think that more initiatives like this should be looked at by way of prevention in sentencing?
I absolutely do think more initiatives like that should be introduced. Let me finish with a personal account, Sir Graham. Before, I've been an MP for just over 20 years now, 22 years nearly. I taught for 20 years before that, mainly in inner-city schools in Nottingham. And they had the challenges that anybody here could recount. And much of the time, when I started teaching, you could choose where you went. It was you could say, I would like to. And I always said I wanted to teach in an inner-city school. Some people stereotype me, maybe for good reason or not, but it sort of helped in Nottingham talking in the way I do, and it helped. But the point was, and this is something for the government, I think, when we went there to raise standards, and without being arrogant, we did in all of the schools that I worked at, we raised standards. There were certain things that we did. There was, and amongst it was a certainty that if you broke the rules, there was a consequence. You know, not, you know, throwing away the key or doing everything or whatever. But people knew there was a consequence. And the alternative provision that my honourable friend had, there was a lot of that. You know, I was the harshest disciplinarian in the school. I wasn't going to have people come in, not in uniform, I wasn't going to have people come in. And people laugh about it, Sir Graham, but the truth of it is, out on our streets, the police need to ensure that that certainty is there.
Yeah, completely right.
But alongside that needs to be the sort of provision my honourable friend has talked about, an opportunity for young people to get work and to have social mobility and to prosper. That is what will stop this knife crime, but also what will stop it. And I say again to the Minister in conclusion, this is a national crisis, a national emergency, and the government simply has to treat it as such by coordinating and driving this change forward rather than just a compartmentalised series of well-intentioned announcements but don't have the passion, drive and enthusiasm that they need to effect real change out in the country.
Julia Lopez.
Very much so, Graham. It's a real pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in what is a vital debate brought by the Honourable Member for Hartlepool, and which is derived from public outrage and a sense of utter despair over what's happening to young people on our streets, and an intense worry that's felt by parents. I entirely echo the passionate view of the Honourable Member for Gedling that this is nothing short of a national emergency. Now, it's perhaps no surprise that my constituency topped the signature count for this petition debate, with the other two Havering constituencies not far behind. 3 weeks ago, we witnessed in Hornchurch and Upminster the brutal and utterly senseless murder of 17-year-old Jodie Chesney in a Harold Hill Park. And we've heard this afternoon from my honourable friend for Romford about just how badly this has affected the community. The community response to Jodie's murder has been profound, with marches and memorials, purple ribbons tied to trees, railings and lampposts in tribute to her, and a community vigil in Harold Hill. There has been practical action too, whether through support for a stronger Harold Hill Street Watch team or new initiatives like the Take a Knife, Save a Life campaign, which seeks to collect weapons from the streets. Now, Havering remains, as we've heard, a comparatively low-crime borough, which partly explains the shock and utter outrage over Jodie's murder. This kind of incident, however, feeds into concerns that the kind of crime we may once have associated with inner boroughs is seeping into the capital's further reaches. And I know we all felt hugely disheartened and worried that only last week we saw a young man being chased down the road and stabbed in the Harold Hill area also. If young people begin to feel unsafe, the temptation only increases for them to carry a weapon too, so it's important not to let such perceptions escalate. And on Friday, I met Rachel Grimwood, who works on alternative provisions in schools, and she was showing me photographs of the kinds of weapons that children are bringing into local schools, many of them concealed as pens, as hairbrushes and so on. And this is creating such a fear amongst the local school community. And she also talked to me about how young people are being coerced into crime, which feeds into this whole idea about whether it's right immediately to issue a sentence when a lot of these young people are finding themselves in these very frightening situations where they are being threatened with violence themselves if they don't also engage in criminal activity. It's no use quoting statistics at communities about comparatively low crime rates. These kinds of incidents reverberate because of their severity, and they lead to a particularly rapid loss of confidence in law and order in suburban areas. Indeed, I think it's a tragedy that we as a Conservative Party are losing that confidence. I've been an MP not much longer than 18 months, but have now met two parents who have lost a child to knife violence. Jamil Saki from Hornchurch was murdered in January 2018 by a fatal stab wound to his heart after accompanying a friend to recover money lost from a scam. He was a beautiful young man, an engineering graduate from a good family, with so much promise and so much life unlived. Jamil did not lose his life in our borough, but in Welwyn Garden City, and his case highlights the issue of the support levels available to families who are not connected into the community and systems of the area in which their child's murder took place. But today's debate is fundamentally one about sentencing for carrying knives, however, and new sentencing guidelines brought in over the summer are already expected to lead to more people going to jail for carrying knives, even though average sentences for such crime have already been going up. While there's a mandatory minimum sentence of 6 months imprisonment for an adult or 4 months for a young person if someone is convicted of a second bladed article offence, if an offender is convicted of threatening with a bladed article, there is a prison sentence straight away, even if it's a first offence. That jail sentence can go up to a maximum of 4 years. We're bringing in new knife crime prevention orders, as we've heard, which are meant to give police more tools in the fight, such as curfews, geographical restrictions and mandatory knife crime courses. But I accept what others have said today about the need for caution as these are rolled out to ensure they are a new solution rather than a new problem. Many of my constituents, as we've heard, want to hear a far tougher, or want to see a far tougher regime, as they've really fundamentally lost confidence in the deterrence effect of these sentences. Now, I appreciate that the Home Office may have concerns, and the Ministry of Justice, about getting the right balance between giving people a last chance to step away from the criminal justice system. So I'd be very appreciative if the Minister could give us information on what has been done to review this balance, given that knife crime statistics are really going in the wrong direction. And also if we could hear what intensive work is being carried out with those young people who are being caught for the first time carrying a blade. I've raised in an earlier knife crime debate my concerns about referrals to youth offender teams, and I've written to the Minister about this as well, and whether the young criminals sent down this route have any fear of it. I should be very keen to get the Minister's comments on whether the effectiveness of yachts is under review, because I know from shopkeepers across my constituency that all too many young people are now going into their stores with a complete sense of omnipotence when it comes to intimidating people, shoplifting and then mugging people on the streets. Beyond sentencing, we must accept there is an issue of both resource and attitude, which is why one of my focuses has been on trying to secure additional police funding for the Met. Policing has become a much more complex activity over the past decade, with officers asked to carry out a much broader range of activities as gangs' business models adapt rapidly with technological change. Following private meetings with the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, we have secured extra money for the Met, and the Chancellor has recently added an extra £100 million for knife crime since Jodie's murder. This resource is, of course, welcome and it's already making an impact, but we now need to see much more consistency in that funding so that officers can plan much longer into the future. Constituents will always want more bobbies on the beat, and they are absolutely vital in gathering critical intelligence through the building of trust. But we also need to make sure that the resource is going into the right places, and I see it as equally important that we have officers who can work on collecting evidence and securing safe convictions. And I note the Honourable Member for Bermondsea's important intervention in this regard when it comes to creating confidence amongst witnesses that if they are going to testify, then those trials are actually going to lead to a conviction. We also need to make sure that we are building very robust cases against criminals much higher up the food chain. It's these criminals who are so ruthlessly exploiting young people as an expendable resource. Similarly, police cannot be expected to plug gaps in other services, and therefore resourcing of social and children's services is critical in stemming a young person's descent into crime. But resource, as I've said before in this House, must be accompanied by leadership at every level to ensure extra cash is directed in the right way and bolstered by a sense of political focus that gives police and all other agencies the confidence to use the full range of their powers. Now, I asked this directly of the Prime Minister in PMQs recently, and I'd be very much grateful for an update from the Minister on the Knife Crime Summit that was committed to. In saying this, I'm not seeking to be partisan, so I wish also to ask the same of the Mayor of London. The mayoral system was designed in part to bring greater democratic accountability to issues like policing and to provide that drive, coordination and focus on performance when it's required. I appreciate that the Mayor is concerned about policing budgets, but I would also like to hear from him how he is articulating to Londoners what he is doing with the budget that he has and what his strategy is to change the weather on these issues. When it comes to leadership and attitude, police need to know that they are supported. In Havering, we're deploying greater stop and search as well as facial recognition technology in our urban centres. But there needs also to be political focus, as I've said, in pulling all parts of the system together and making them talk to one another. It's clear from my work in the borough that councillors, policing teams, charities, community members, churchgoers are all doing fantastic work looking at school exclusions, family breakdowns, flagging at-risk youngsters. Most recently, I've met with Hornchurch charities Say It With Your Chest and You and Me Counselling, who focus respectively on excluded children and parents who feel at a loss as to how to best handle their disruptive children. But we need to make sure this kind of work is directed into a broader local strategy to ensure it's not just piecemeal or overlapping with existing initiatives. Council consultation on youth violence, for instance, will carry much less weight if it's not engaging with the right people and the right young people in the area who are most affected by it. And those charities with a presence on the ground are much likelier to be able to identify and relate to who those children are. When I carry out school visits, I am struck by the consistency with which mental health is brought up as an issue. Young people are struggling to understand their purpose, worth and value, often deriving from a negative family and home environment and fuelled by a lack of belonging or a greater community around them. And this is why they feel so often vulnerable to a gang structure where they get sucked into a spiral of negative activity. I recently met one of our Harold Hill counsellors who had herself experienced that sense of dislocation during her school years, and she highlighted to me the need for engagement programmes that are relevant particularly to the communities that they're trying to plug into. For instance, she was a British Nigerian, and she said that it's much more effective if you have people from those communities talking to those communities themselves, rather than having that sense of somebody trying to interfere from the outside. Nobody should pretend these issues are easy to solve, because they're not. After all, the perverse sense of entitlement that allowed someone to see it as their right to take someone's life in such a brutal way when it came to the murder of Jodie Chesney betrays a complete absence of values, decency and human empathy. But we have been here before when it comes to knife crime, and we do know what works. Criminals need to know that our attempts to understand their path to violence will be complemented with a hard-nosed intolerance of the mindless destruction they mete out. One of the reasons my constituents support tougher knife sentencing is that people believe it is time we showed that communities are back within our control, and a key part of that will be taking criminals off the streets. But that is not solution enough, and I would be grateful for the Minister's assurances that knife crime will be the subject of relentless political focus, such that we get the system, whether it's criminal justice, education, policing, community outreach, firing on every cylinder.
Thank you, Sir Graham. And let me start by thanking the Petitions Committee and the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for organising this debate, and it's a pleasure to follow on from the Honourable Lady and to have heard what she had to say. Now, Sir Graham, Ryan Passy, Christina Edkins, two young people from Dudley, tragically murdered with knives. Jaskaran Kang, last year, Yasir Hussain, Christopher Harm, both losing their lives in Dudley too. Elsewhere in the Black Country last year, Regan Asprey, James Brindley, both tragically killed on nights out. And our hearts go out to their families and friends. People in Dudley, I think, are furious about the increase in knife crime. They want tougher action and more police on the streets to deal with this. The responsibility obviously lies, Sir Graham, with the people who go out with a knife and then use it, but you wouldn't have needed a crystal ball to predict that cutting the number of police officers, huge cuts, as we've heard, to neighbourhood policing teams, closing youth centres, sports projects, community centres and other organisations that keep young people off the streets, sending fewer people to prison. You wouldn't have needed a crystal ball to predict that all of that would mean that crime, and tragically violent crime, would increase. It's shocking, Sir Graham, to read the results of an investigation in today's Express and Star. Less than 1 in 3 criminals arrested with a knife in the West Midlands are sent to prison. The paper is completely right to describe the situation in the West Midlands as a knife crime epidemic, with the number of cases up 20% over the last year. Now, the points made by my right honourable friend, the member for Gedling, they're all fair enough. They're completely right, of course. But how can it be the case that criminals are being spared jail despite committing dozens of offences? According to media reports this weekend, one dangerous offender was convicted 21 times for possession of a knife without being sent to prison. 21 times. Another committed 33 assaults before eventually being jailed for the 34th. The West Midlands Police Chief Constable, Dave Thompson, has declared knife crime across the region an emergency. He's implemented extensive stop and search powers following a spate of fatal stabbings in Birmingham. The force said it had stopped and searched 408 people using its new powers over 4 days early this month, arresting 24 people and seizing 14 weapons. Yes, of course.
thank my honourable friend for giving way. And he's highlighting the situation in the West Midlands. Would you agree with me that the proportion of people who are being sent to prison for knife offences has actually doubled in recent years, and we lock more people up in this country than any other European country, and there are currently around 400 children on life sentences or sentences over 14 years in this country, and the rest of the EU combined, there are just 2 children serving life sentences. So although I understand his point and his frustration, I absolutely do, I think at a national level we need to accept that we put a lot of people in prison already, and you know, we need to consider very carefully increasing that number even more.
Look, I commend my honourable friend for the work she does with the all-party group on this, and I sort of understand the point she makes, but in the end I think if someone has committed 21 offences, been caught 21 times with a knife, or been convicted of 33 assaults, I think somebody like that should be in prison. I mean, I do. And I think, frankly, I mean, I'll come on to this, I'll talk more about it in a minute, but I think there should be strong sentences for this sort of thing, and there should be tough deterrents. And of course, and I'll talk about this as well, you know, we've got to have all the other things that she's talked about with the all-party group going on in society as well to prevent people being sucked into crime. But when people do use knives and do behave violently, then I think there should be tough. I think there should be tough sentences for that. And I think society does need to send out a strong message that it is completely unacceptable. And whilst numbers of people being imprisoned might have gone up recently, they certainly fell in the few years before that under this government. I think it's fair to say. According to Ministry of Justice figures, 1,182 people were cautioned or convicted by West Midlands Police in 2018 for possession of a knife or offensive weapon, but just 347, 29%, went to prison. And that represents a 7% drop on the previous year, and it's under the national average as well. In 326 cases across the region, knife criminals were handed a community order, 256 offenders were given a suspended sentence, and a further 99 were fined or discharged from court without a sentence. One in 4 of the criminals cautioned or convicted were children. What a tragedy it is that children are going out with knives.
Thank you, the honourable member, very much for giving way. Just on the record, on the question of the number of people in prison, we've gone from approximately 40,000 people in prison in 1995 towards a situation where we now have 82,000 people in prison. The British population during that period has grown by about 15%. The number of people in prison has almost doubled. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. So we have to be a bit cautious with this idea that somehow we're soft on justice in this country.
Well, I'm sure that, I'm sure the Minister is going to quote all sorts of figures as to why the knife crime epidemic, isn't the government's fault and isn't the result of not sending enough people to prison and isn't because they've not kept the promises that they made before they were elected 8 or 9 years ago. And I'll come on to this in a moment. Look, it's all well and good in the end for the government to claim people caught with a knife are more likely to be jailed now than any time over the past 10 years. But that's because the numbers being jailed, as I said a moment ago, fell after they came to power almost 10 years ago, despite all the promises that were made so loudly and so frequently in opposition. And that was very clear. We were promised that anyone caught carrying a knife would go to jail. In 2008, the then leader of the Conservative Party gave an interview to The Sun, which reported on it saying, "Anyone caught carrying a knife will be jailed under a Tory government. David Cameron vows today." The Conservative leader declares automatic jail terms for carrying a dangerous knife is the only way of smashing the current epidemic gripping broken Britain. He repeated this pledge to relatives of high-profile victims, such as the father of Damilola Taylor and the former EastEnders star Brooke Kinsella, whose brother had been tragically murdered. Yet the Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands says the courts are still failing to hand out sentences that reflect public demands for justice after criminals have been arrested and charged. Just on this, by the way, I'd like to ask the Minister if he would... Ryan Passy, the young man I mentioned earlier who was killed tragically on a night out in Stourbridge, Nobody has, despite a lengthy police investigation and a court case, nobody was actually convicted for that. And it's a source of huge public concern in Dudley and the Black Country, and a big campaign by his family and friends. And it's an issue that I've been working on along with the Honourable Member for Stourbridge. So I'd like to ask the Minister perhaps if he'll consider meeting me and her and people campaigning about that particular case, so he can perhaps examine that in detail. Now, of course, on this issue, we need, schools, youth services, police support, more opportunities for young people. Of course, we need all of those things, as my right honourable friend for Gedling said a moment ago. But what people in Dudley also want to see are more police on the streets and tougher sentences with proper punishments to prevent people from going out with a knife in the first place.
John Howe.
Thank you, Sir Graham. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I would like to start by thanking the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for introducing this debate. Let me begin where I was going to end, and that is reinforcing with the Minister the fact that here, in a cross-party atmosphere, we are taking this issue very seriously. There is a huge amount of commitment to it, and the strength of feeling for dealing with this is absolutely enormous. And I think if the Minister listens to all of the contributions that are being made, he will get that as the feeling that is being made in this chamber. I was going to start by looking at the situation in my own constituency. But the situation is, it depends how you look at it, is either not very good or actually too good to be able to do that. I looked through the neighbourhood plan, the neighbourhood policing reports recently, one for the Henley area and one for an area that covers a whole number of areas around Thames. And in the Henley area, there was no example of knife crime in the neighbourhood reports. In the Thames area, there were 2 areas of knife crime. So you may think that I have no great ability to be able to stand up here and to talk about this issue. But my constituency is in the middle of the Thames Valley police area. And the Thames Valley police area is a very, very wide area. It includes Oxford, it includes Abingdon, it includes Reading, and it includes Slough. And the Minister will be aware that in Oxford we had an example of a knife attack only recently, and that has really been brought home to the people, not just in Oxford, but all of those who live around it. Now, the figures show that the number of knife attacks in the Thames Valley was in just marginally short of 1,300. That's in 2017-18. And that is the highest figure that there has been since 2010. So that's just about 50% increase for the number of knife crimes that were committed in 2012-13. And that number keeps coming up amongst the areas that we're looking at. The Thames Valley police area is the largest area of knife crime in the whole of the southeast. It far outstrips counties like Kent, like Sussex, and like Surrey, and it stands out in marked contrast to the calm and peaceful nature of that area when you look at it as a whole. And if you look at what the knife crime has been involved in, it's been involved in 7 murders, 40 rapes, 10 sexual attacks, and 86 threats to kill. This is not a gang warfare. This is a much greater crime that involves us all. Now, I agree with my right honourable friend from Gedling that this is not a simple task to overcome this, because in the Thames Valley area, recruitment is actually up, and there is a tremendous amount of work that is being done to look at the intakes. And I agree with my honourable friend that numbers will always make a difference. They will always make a difference to this. But we're asking the question, do they make the difference? And I think I agree with the right honourable member for Gedling that they don't make the difference, because you need to take into account a whole number of other things. And what the police want, above all, to tackle this, is the certainty that the increase in numbers that they are seeing at the moment and being able to tackle the recruitment will continue for the future. They don't know that at the moment, and they do need certainty over that. But an equally big role that they play, and I think it has been mentioned already by a member in this debate, is in partnership with a number of other organisations. And though the agencies and the organisations that they're in partnership include the NHS, they include a whole lot of other organisations, but the one that I have the most sympathy for is the relationship that the police have set up with schools. Here they have a chance of breaking the link of knife crime to drugs, and as the Deputy Police Crime Commissioner said, once a young person has a knife, it's almost too late. It's almost too late. And this is a way of breaking that link. Now, we've also heard quite a lot about stop and search, and that has increased completely in the area by something like just over 50%. But I have a mixed feeling about stop and search. I participated in a group that included police and crime commissioners, that included members of the police, that included other politicians. And there was a tremendous backlash amongst the group, including the police, against just carrying on with stop and search as it was. They really didn't see that that was creating a favourable climate in which to tackle this issue, because of all of the things that were associated with the history of stop and search. But what we did agree was that any stop and search needed to be intelligence-led. It needed to be proportionate, and it needed to be appropriate. And I'm very pleased that the initiatives that have been taken by the Thames Valley Police have all been intelligence-led and are having great effect. Yes, we should and can increase the sentences, and we have a unique position in this House for being able to comment on the guidelines that are issued whenever sentencing is looked at and when new guidelines are issued. And the Justice Select Committee always comments on them. And from what I have heard here, I will certainly take back to that committee a more concentrated effort on making sure that we are blunt as we can be in giving that information to judges. As I said in my intervention, we all have a role to play in this process, and that's why in the UQ I asked the question as to what role we can play as MPs, because I've noticed that many MPs are very much in the role of observers in this, but haven't yet found a way to become participants in this. And the Minister thought that I had uncovered a pot of gold in saying this. I wish I had. I wish there was a pot of gold for this. But I do think it is appropriate. And if the Minister today knows what has happened to that initiative, on which I think there has been some progress, it would be very nice for him to tell us. Thank you.
Mr. Slaughter. Sir Graham, it's a pleasure to be here on your
chairmanship this afternoon. We were here just a few weeks ago debating this subject in this chamber, and indeed it's come up regularly, but we had the urgent question on Friday in the main chamber. It's also right, as my honourable friend for Gedling said in his extraordinarily passionate and persuasive speech, that it's several weeks now since we heard first of all about the Knife Crime Summit, which apparently will happen sometime next week. And then in asking the Minister questions about that on Friday, I said I sincerely hope that it would not be a talking shop, and we would see some actual resources and some actual action as a consequence of that. And I'm very glad that we are at last taking this issue seriously, and we are debating it on a regular basis, and it's a hope that that debate leads to action. But I can't help beginning my remarks by observing that since we were last here, and since the Knife Crime Summit was announced, there have been 2 murders in my borough. One was of a 17-year-old boy, and a 15-year-old has been charged with that offence. And one, just a week ago, just outside my constituency, was of a 29-year-old young man who, again, was stabbed to death needlessly, pointlessly, in an ordinary street. And it's often said, and I think that one of the reasons why we are now taking this very seriously, that for every one of these tragic murders that takes place, there are 100 other stabbings and incidents, some of which aren't even reported to the police, some of which are known only to the doctors that treat them, and perhaps thousands of instances of young people carrying weapons. And I think it really, and I don't want to exaggerate, because on the whole our constituencies are still safe places, and walking around them at night or at any time and walking around anywhere in them is a perfectly safe and reasonable thing to do. But there is a change, there is a cultural change, and there is a change in the way that communities feel about knife crime now, that it isn't just 1 or 2 people or gangs or known criminals in that way. It's something which is inculcating the whole atmosphere where we live. And that's why I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that it's a national emergency or that it's not a matter for COBRA. I think this is something that we have to take extremely seriously. One of the young people who died, Ayub Hassan, as I say, 17 years old, he was born and lived in my constituency, and he was killed in my constituency. He was, as his mother told me, he was her best friend. She's inconsolable at his death. And as I say, although there's almost a pyramid at which the killings are the top of that pyramid, and we worry about every offence that's taking place, there's something absolutely significant about young lives being taken in this way, and the opportunity that is lost, and the way that people didn't have a chance to live their lives, and how that affects their siblings, their parents, their wider family, and often the whole community where they live. And this really is something we have to get to grips with. And it is an incredibly complex, a multi-layered issue which will take a number of years to get right, but it's also something which requires absolutely urgent action now. Now, this debate is about sentencing, and that's an important aspect, but I think from all the speeches that we've heard so far, that is only one element. I suspect that my views on that are probably closer to the Minister's than they are to a member for Dudley. As a former Shadow Justice spokesman myself, it's something I've looked into in some detail. I'm not a big fan of mandatory sentencing, and as has been pointed out, mandatory sentencing itself often has a degree of discretion which the courts make due and proper use of. We have to leave, there are sentencing guidelines, but we have to leave individual cases to what we have a very competent judiciary, not a soft judiciary in the country. As we've heard, we have one of the highest incarceration rates. Yes, there should be appropriate sentencing, and yes, people should be locked up for many offences, whether that is carrying or whether that is using, or whether that is serious violence that results from knife crime. But we're not going to solve this by sentencing policy. We do need to start with policing. We do need to start with what a number of members have said, which is proper community policing. The loss of that in London over the last few years has made a dramatic difference. When it started, it was an experiment. We were told it was about reassurance. It was about, there were times of greater plenty as far as the public funds went, and it was felt that we could afford to put, in addition to all the things that were supposed to work, the response policing, detection and things of that kind, that we could have the luxury, if you like, of putting police back on the streets, bobbies on the beat, community officers, and that would be something which the police would have told you, well, we're not going to catch people doing crimes, we're not going to solve crimes in that way, but it's important that as a sort of community role we can do that. And I think that if you talk to a lot of senior police officers, they admit that they were wrong about that. It has had a very, very valuable role in reducing crime, because if you have a dedicated, in both senses of the term, group of police, even quite a small group of police, and it was typically 6 per ward, who got to know the community, who got to know the people who were good and the people who were bad, that the intelligence that they collected, that their knowledge of what was going on, meant that it wasn't just about reassurance, it was about policing that community in the way that we do best in this country, by consent and with the support of the community in that way. But it is resource intensive. And so it's impossible, I think, for those who agree on whatever party they come from with that, not to acknowledge the fact that those resources were just taken away. And actually the Mayor of London has done a very good job in putting resources back, because we were down to 1 officer per ward at one point. And I think that it's a semantic thing to say that ward boundaries are the problem. The resources are the problem here, and they do need to be increased, and that needs to happen quickly in order to, because if it prevents further serious injury, further deaths in that way, then it's going to go at least some way to turning this juggernaut around, because at the moment all the indications are is we are going in the wrong direction. Now I do believe, and I'll make a pact with members opposite, that if they will concede that there is a resource issue here and that resources have been cut back too far, local authorities have lost 50% of their funding, and that means that often things which are discretionary, like youth centres and youth funding, have been cut by even more than 50%. And most of the youth clubs have closed over time in my constituency, and the resources that are available in that way. And when they were being closed, it was quite fashionable for some politicians to say, well, you know, how on earth does youth work, or how on earth does diversionary activity decide whether people are going to go out with a piece of metal and stab someone or not? Well, I mean, those comparisons are crass, quite frankly, because to put the opposite argument, if you make young people, if you give them something useful to do, if you make them feel worthwhile about themselves, if you show that you're investing in them and their neighbourhoods and their communities, they have a different outlook on life. Life doesn't become hopeless. It doesn't just become a way of wasting and spending time and getting into trouble in that way. So I say, if I'll make a pact that if members on all sides will admit that we have to reverse this absolute drain on resources in our local communities, I won't make a party political issue of it, and I concede that I think everybody is of goodwill on this matter. Whatever their views on particular aspects on sentencing or penal policy or where the investment should go, I do believe that there is a will across political parties in response to some of the horrific things that we've seen, that we must get this right. But having that as an intention is a very good start. It's not where we actually need to go. The second thing we need to do is we need to engage some of the expertise, some of the knowledge that is out there. Now, part of that is in our policing and our judiciary and amongst our medics and amongst those who are experts in the field, but part of it is in the community. Now, I spent half an hour at surgery this morning with a mother of a young boy in my constituency who hadn't actually come to ask me to do anything. In fact, it was really the surgery was almost the other way around. I learnt far more from her than she did from me in that discussion. We spent half an hour talking about exactly this problem and what happens. And she said, in relation to her son, that he had a very late diagnosis of special needs, so all the trouble he was having during primary school was just put down to bad behaviour rather than any diagnosis in that way. He ended up being excluded from secondary school at an early stage. He therefore went into alternative provision, which she said was dreadful and dire. But it wasn't just the actual fact that he wasn't being properly educated and his needs weren't being identified and action being taken in that way. It's the fact that he'd suddenly been, before he was a teenager even, he'd been cast out. He was now excluded. He was now no longer part of acceptable society. But the second thing that happened is, of course, he was put with all the other naughty boys. And what happened? All the naughty boys go around together, perhaps not doing terribly bad things to begin with. But after a while, one or two of them would get into trouble. One or two of them would get convictions for this, that, or the other, a bit of criminal damage of that kind. Her son, has now got a conviction for carrying a knife in that way. But how this comes about and how it's either neglect or bureaucracy or lack of intervention or lack of resources from statutory bodies of all different kinds, and where that leaves the parents. So one of the things which my honourable friend, who's not here now, the member for Brentford Isleworth, who's tragically had a death in her own constituency over the weekend, said this to me: where is the support for the parents? Where is the support for the parents of victims? Where is also the support for parents who are trying to do their best to keep children out of trouble in that way, who really are, who worry every night about where their sons or daughters may be? Yes, of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. And it was just on the very powerful point he was making about who you come into contact with when you are first sort of, getting into trouble as a young offender, say, and what could be seen as the unintended consequence of what we're debating today with regard to sentencing, that if it was an automatic 10-year sentence for carrying a knife on, on first arrest, then that could be, a young person who hadn't actually done anything, hadn't been in trouble at all, will then find themselves in not just youth offending, but in the prison population with some very, very, bad people who have done a lot worse things, and that could lead, it could be an unintended consequence of not what we're sort of hoping to achieve with this, with this sentence, and it could actually turn just someone who was scared and carrying a knife into a hardened criminal eventually.
Well, I'm grateful. My honourable friend shows a lot of compassion, but a lot of real understanding in relation to this. I'm not advocating a soft approach. On the contrary, I think we need rigour. We need rigour in the system, but it's not a knee-jerk reaction that says suddenly we're going to cure this by sentencing. How often have we heard that in relation to every possible offence? And isn't that what's driven the prison population to double? And isn't that what's driven conditions in prison and the assistance for people in prison and indeed leaving prison to be so dire in this country that frankly it's an international embarrassment? So I don't want to say very much more, Mr. Davis, and welcome you to the chair. I do believe that we are not just well-intentioned but resolved to try and tackle this issue. I do believe the expertise is out there, and I do believe part of that is listening to our communities in that way. But we are going to have. I'm almost dreading this summit next week because I fear that what it will be is a talking shop and a couple of press releases and not very much more than that to get the government through another week or two. And I hope the Minister is going to tell us that's not the case. I also hope that we're going to hear the Minister before 7 o'clock, because I'm not going to be here after that. Apologies to you. But if I miss the end of his speech, then I will, as I always do with his speeches, read it diligently, and I know that it will be worth reading, because I think he shares that view. But the people who signed this petition, the people who drafted it and motivated it, I absolutely respect what they're trying to achieve, because they are expressing exactly that frustration that the mother who came to see me today was, which is, we are standing around looking powerless. They might think we're disinterested, we're not. We are standing around, we are not solving problems that are solvable, and they are getting worse and worse, and they are not just affecting individuals, they are affecting whole communities now. And this is a national emergency, and it's something which we need to act upon.
Thank you. Can I invite my successor, Sarah Jones, to make a contribution?
Thank you, Mrs. Davis. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I start by congratulating the member for Hartlepool and for saying this is a really good cross-party debate where I think we're agreeing on a lot of issues. Gosh, I wish the member for Gedling was my teacher when I didn't realise you were a teacher for 20. He was a teacher for 20 years, and I feel like I would have listened a lot more in school if you'd have been teaching me. It's right that we should pay tribute to the family, of course, of Jodie Chesney that members have spoken about being from their area. I also, of course, want us to think today about the members. The people who've died in my constituency, Kelva Smith, Andre Adaremi and Jermaine Goupil, 3 people who lost their lives recently through knife crime. I'm not going to talk about the need for funding, because I know that we've established that and I think we all agree, and I would just say on the need for funding, not just around youth work and education, but also around housing, that I currently have a mother and an 8-year-old daughter in my office being refused housing by anybody, completely destitute, desperately trying today to get her somewhere to sleep the night. And these issues massively impact on what happens to the life chances of our children, and we must not ever forget that kind of wider issue. But I wanted today to just focus down onto the issue of sentencing, because that's what we're debating, and I think the issue is too important not to look at the facts about sentencing and about actually what impact it has. Now, we know that knife crime is at epidemic levels, over 100 cases a day of knife offences. Fatalities, their highest on record, with 285 people dead last year. And knife crime has gone up, as has already been spoken, across every area virtually in the country, every police force. It is young people who are disproportionately affected. 39 young people were killed last year, which is the highest level for 10 years. And there's been more than a 50% increase in stabbings of teenagers, according to NHS figures, with over 1,000 admitted to hospital with stab wounds last year. There's 1,000 teenagers stab wounds last year. And we know that many don't actually ever go to A&E because they're scared of what might happen. People are rightly concerned about this national crisis, but it is my view that dramatically increasing sentences for knife offences is not the answer. We can't enforce our way out of this problem with increasing sentences. We already have a tough regime for knife offenders, which has been getting tougher for the last decade. As I said previously, we lock more people up than any EU country. There are 400 children on life sentences or sentences over 14 years currently in prison. The proportion of people being sent to prison for knife offences has almost doubled. In 2010, around 40% of people caught with a knife were given a custodial sentence. Today, the proportion of knife possession offences receiving a custodial sentence is closer to 70%. Last year, more than a third of knife offenders received an immediate jail sentence. And in 2015, the government brought in, as I mentioned earlier, their two strikes policy, meaning anyone over 18 who is caught twice gets a minimum 6-month jail term. And despite those changes, since 2013, knife offences have risen from 25,000 to over 40,000. So despite what it might seem, the evidence shows that tougher sentences do not deter people from committing crime. There are 4 main factors that go into sentencing decisions: punishment, deterrence, public protection and rehabilitation. We're looking at all of those 4. In terms of punishment, people who commit knife offences, particularly attacks on other people, absolutely need to see strict punishments, but these are already available under the law. The types of punishments we're debating today are not proportionate or appropriate for the vast majority of knife crime, particularly as young people are disproportionately the ones involved. The majority of children, as we've already talked about, carrying knives are extremely vulnerable, and it's increasingly evident that many are being criminally exploited, groomed and coerced, and punishing them with punitive sentences risks turning this generation of young people into a generation in prison. In terms of deterrence...
Yes. I just wonder if my honourable friend could go into some details that she's picked up through all of our work on this area about why some of these young people are carrying the knives. I know there's been lots of coverage on this point on some of our news media, and fear seems to be the main thing, but I just wondered if she had sort of some more details she could give on that.
I could, and I could speak for far too long about that issue. I think you can't say all young people carry knives for this reason. Everybody has a different story to tell. There is vulnerability in many of the tales of the young people that I've met, and there is fear. You're absolutely right. And we know that knife crime is contagious. We can see it. It acts like a disease. It spreads. And if some people, and I've seen it in Croydon, if people in a school are known to have been carrying a knife, other people will start to carry a knife. So you have this situation where people are not in gangs, they're not dealing drugs, they're carrying knives because they feel that they need to, and so when there's a fight, instead of using your fists, you use a knife. And so there's a whole raft of issues going on here that we've already talked about: the involvement in drugs, the involvement in gangs, the violence in the home as a family, in your early years. There's all kinds of things that lead to people carrying knives, but definitely fear is a very big one of those. In terms of deterrence, it's not just from the evidence of knife crime over the last few years. There's a large body of research which shows that simply setting longer sentences doesn't deter crime. And I know that the Minister knows this very well, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. Research consistently shows that, if anything, it is the certainty of being caught, not how severe the sentence is, that acts as a deterrent. A recent evidence review concluded that lengthy prison sentences and mandatory minimum sentencing cannot be justified on grounds of deterrence. For sentences to be a factor in deterring crime, people need to know what the punishment for the crime is and then make a rational choice whether to offend. But awareness of sentencing is very low, and many people involved in knife crime do not, of course, act rationally, particularly young people. And the people who've attended all-party meetings with us, who've been in and out of prison carrying knives, say that prison is not a deterrent at all. They actually say it's a break from the streets, and they can be safe for a while before they have to go back. In terms of public protection, and this is very important, of course we must keep people safe by making sure dangerous people are not on our streets. Home Office research found that a 15% increase in the use of custody would be required to see just a 1% decrease in crime. Our prisons are already overflowing, as we've talked about, and surely it would be better for the government to build on their recent £100 million boost to police funding and set a strong new basis for police funding in the autumn statement to deter people through the policing that we have on the streets, rather than trying to fund a huge increase in custodial sentences, which would have a very small decrease in crime impact. In terms of rehabilitation, we know that dealing with children and young people outside the formal justice system is more effective at reducing offending than punitive responses. Involving a young person in custody has the effect of making them more likely to commit crime in the future. Young people who spoke to us in the all-party group talked about prison as a bit of a training camp, because your colleagues around you were also likely to kind of teach you a way of increased crime rather than reducing. And of course, as the Minister again will know, conditions in prisons do not lend themselves to positive rehabilitation. Young people can be locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, and research has found that they face hunger, denial of fresh air, cramped and dirty cells, strip searching, segregation and authorised infliction of severe pain, uncivilised conditions for suicidal children, and bullying and intimidation. What?
I'm very grateful, and I do apologise for interrupting her excellent speech, but along with this, the rehabilitation of offenders is, I would think that part of the problem is the recidivism of repeat offenders. Does she have an opinion about the part played by our now poorly functioning privatised probation service, and that offenders probably are not being rehabilitated as well as they perhaps should be?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. There's a cycle. You talk to surgeons in King's Hospital and they'll tell you they see the same children coming back again and again. You talk to the prison system and they'll say that the same children are going back time and time again. The same cycle of going into prison, out of prison, committing a crime, getting stabbed. These things are cyclical, and it's awful, and we need to break the we need to break that process and get children and young people away from the situation that they're in. So I think on all the kind of four measures of why you would sentence people, the case for harsher sentencing in this area is just not there on the basis of evidence. And I won't go into talking about the public health approach and what we should be doing in terms of prevention, but I did want to just highlight some work that was done in my borough of Croydon, which I think paints the picture of where we need to go with our young people. So Croydon completed what I think is a landmark report investigating the cases of 60 vulnerable adolescents. And those 60 children had all been involved in serious cases of violence or exploitation. 5 had died, had lost their lives. 3 had been convicted of murder. A third of the boys had been victims of knife crime, and 3/4 were involved in gangs, and more than half the girls in this cohort had been victims of sexual exploitation. So of these 60 people that had been deeply involved in violence, half of them had been known to children's social services before the age of 5. So we knew who these children were right from the very beginning, and in all of these cases there were many interventions by the state, but they didn't work. So the state was involved in a very crisis management way. So when something happened, there was an intervention, but the state didn't do the right things to help those children. Half of those 60 children had witnessed or experienced domestic violence. And that's where we know violence breeds violence. It's learned behaviour. You see it in the home. You do it later on in life. 3/4 of the children had a parental absence on the father's side, and 1/4 an absence on the mother's side. There was a lot of parental issues around drug or alcohol misuse and mental health funding. A third of the children had already been excluded by the time they left primary school, and every single child who was later convicted of a crime had been excluded from school, every single child of those 60. I think I won't talk more about what that says, but I think it says to all of us that these are vulnerable children that are growing up with very difficult situations, and that doesn't excuse the crime at all. But in so many of the cases I've come across, who's the victim and who's the perpetrator is just luck of the fight. And these are children that, I don't think it's right to categorise them as kind of the evil ones who are perpetrating the crimes and the victims, because often actually they can cross over. I know in some cases people are being harmed when they have absolutely nothing to do with anything, but in other cases actually they're all in a difficult situation because they're all very vulnerable, and I would argue that putting them in prison for longer is not the answer. And if you look at what they do in Scotland and the youth offending prison there, where they are putting far less young people in prison and focusing on the ones who are there in terms of giving them lots of training, lots of teaching them to read and write, giving them education and giving them skills, that has to be the right approach for the long term, I would argue. And I think this is a national crisis, and the member for Gedling put it absolutely correctly that the government needs to come together as a piece and tackle this. But I think for this debate, sentencing is not the answer. There are many other things that are.
Thank you. Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr Davies, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And it's a real delight to follow my honourable friend for Croydon Central, who's done so much detailed work in this regard. And also, I wanted to put on record the work of the Youth Crime Commission, which my honourable friend, the member for Lewisham Deptford, has also been working on during this Parliament. I also wanted to put on record how much I appreciated the passion with which the member for Gedling spoke about his personal experience, and I remember attending a conference speech by him in 1999 in Bournemouth, where he had people along when he was police minister talking about young people and a positive involvement with police. So he has a wealth of experience in this area, and it's a real pleasure to hear that he hasn't lost that passion for young people and for social justice. Mr Davies, could I also thank the member for Hartlepool for introducing today's debate, and also for the many interesting speeches from both sides of the House, and our excellent contributions from the member for Washington and Sunderland, and her expert knowledge in particularly young children, nutrition and all the elements that go to make up positive primary school, which we hear makes such a difference in terms of the long-term outcomes for people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. This debate is about sentencing, Mr Davies, but I wanted briefly to talk on enforcement and on prevention, just to set the scene. There can be no more difficult thing for a Member of Parliament than to meet the grieving family of a youngster who's lost to knife crime. And on the 22nd of February of this year, Kamal Gabadon Link was stabbed multiple times and lost his life. And that was a real tragedy, and one that I've been very involved with, going to the gold groups with the police, working with the council, working with the Wood Green Business Improvement District to talk about our high street and how we can use the physical surrounds of our high street to improve our environment. But at the heart of it is a tragedy, not just for this young man's family, for his mother, who is in grieving, for his son, who's lost a father, but for all the youngsters who knew him and loved him. And I think, as the member for Upminster, the member for Hornchurch and Upminster said she'd met relatives as well, and I think it just brings it home to us just how many more people are affected now than perhaps 10 years ago. And for those of us who have been involved in public policy for 10 or 15 years, before it was one terrible thing, perhaps over a 3 or 4 year period. Now it's something which seems to be far too regular, and it's the number of people who are now facing the impacts of knife crime which makes this the national emergency which we've all agreed it is today. Just to give one example, Mr Davies, the terrible case of Kamal Gabadon Link, he passed away by loss of blood in a hair salon, and there were a number of children either having their hair cut or whose parents were having their hair cut, and they witnessed this dreadful loss of life and heard the young man's last words, and they will never forget that. An 8-year-old, a 4-year-old, a mother with a tiny baby, just getting their hair cut. And I think this just does point to this feeling that it's just become the Wild West. And I think that's particularly something which we need to bear in mind, just the numbers of people who are now affected. The other thing about our victim support is it works according to quite a rigid model. Those people were considered to be suspects, not suspects, people were considered to be witnesses to a crime. But in actual fact, they also were victims of that crime because they suffered trauma and stress. And it took an intervention by myself at a round table at my advice surgery to actually gain support, expert counselling support for those families. If I hadn't intervened, I don't believe that those families now would be receiving the expertise and the counselling which they need. So I think our victim support needs to be much more holistic in its approach to who is affected by knife crime. Mr Davies, we have been through the statistics about the lack of police, and as members today have said, because we are in a national emergency, we need to look at the enforcement side, and we need to talk about both sentencing and police numbers and the lack of police in our schools. We used to always have, in London schools anyway, a full-time police officer in the school that the children knew, and that developed a great relationship of trust. And now they're spread much more thinly, and they're often not the same police officers in the same schools all the time, and I think that's something which we need to put right. My view on funding, for what it's worth, Mr Davies, is if we can spend $800 million a week on Brexit, I think we can spend more on the safety of our families and young people. I briefly also wanted to talk about the work that's being done throughout the rest of the criminal justice system, and like many today, I believe the legislation's probably right, and I'm sure with the expertise that honourable members have here, I trust their views on that. But I wonder whether, seeing we have got the Prisons Minister with us, whether he could say what he thinks constitutes a positive prison experience. I'm one of the members who's involved in the MP scheme to visit prisons. I'm looking forward to my first visit next Friday to ISIS, I believe. And I was wondering what the Minister feels is the actual key to a positive prison experience, because some people say that a short experience in prison is worse than a longer experience, because some of the prison officers who are excellent, who are working in our prison system, do have a really positive impact on many of our young people, particularly at our youth offending institutes. So I'd be very interested to hear the Minister's views on that. Briefly, to expand on the view from the Honourable Member for Croydon Central, the literacy rates we know are very low in our prison system, and what is being done during those sentences to push up those rates? Are there proper college courses? What are we doing so that when young people come out of prison, they're ready to go into jobs and employment? I can't mention prisons without mentioning the use of drugs and the fact that drugs are having a really negative effect on the staff inside prisons as well. We know that that can lead to attacks on staff, and that staff themselves can become high as a result of the spice that's being used and other drugs that are being used in the prison system. So for the Honourable Member for Dudley mentioned that the Express newspaper has been calling for longer sentences. But if the longer sentences is just more of a low-quality experience with more drug use and more attacks on staff, low morale, lack of skills training, lack of literacy or other meaningful, purposeful activities, then I can't support more and more and longer sentences if that's not going to actually address the problem. The other element, of course, is the National Audit Office commentary on the privatised service, the fact that it's poor value for money, and also the fact that it's not leading to the sorts of outcomes that we want to see, with very high rates of recidivism, which the member for Washington and Sunderland mentioned earlier, and unfortunately a revolving door. Just a very brief point as well, Mr Davies, on the prevention strategy. The member for Croydon Central mentioned the social services involvement with young people, and I wanted briefly to mention that the member for Tottenham and I, who work very closely on this in the Haringey Borough, met with the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, several months ago now, who promised to look at this again, who promised to look at the resources and the interconnection between the numbers of police, the probation service, the prison experience, and yet we still do have this crisis on our hands. And it's just an absolute tragedy that we're not able to get a grip on this particular service situation. So in terms of the things that local authorities can do, firstly, of course, the bigger picture on funding, but specifically on the point which has been made about even primary school children beginning some kind of journey into a life of crime at the end of primary school, beginning of secondary school. I have personally sought a meeting with the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government so that we can discuss for Haringey Borough which incidentally has the highest level of police resource currently out of any other London borough due to our problems, and basically asking the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government to look at our borough for a special fund for a buddying and mentoring system for the families which the member for Croydon Central described, so that it's not just a social services sort of punitive approach, but it's a friendly approach, so that right when those first letters come home from the school saying that this youngster is not coping in school, the buddying and mentoring can go into the family and help, and maybe help with other siblings or whatever it is that's stopping that youngster from thriving in school, so that we can keep young people in school for as long as possible, because we know that if we look at the prison population, so many of them have been expelled from school or excluded from school from an early age. Mr Davies, I'm going to wind up my remarks now, but I just wanted to conclude by saying that whilst it's tempting to jump on a bandwagon about longer sentences, more sentences, I think the Minister himself has realised that it's got to be about the quality of rehabilitation in prisons, and that we have to look much more closely at resources in schools and early intervention. We need to also to look at whatever local strategies there are and where the excellence there. I know that a lot of good practice is carried out in Glasgow, and that's certainly worth looking at for other local authority areas. I want to emphasise the fact that with Brexit costing $800 million a week, there must be more that we can spend on this crucial situation. And also to re-emphasise how pleased I am to see that members across the House are joining together to genuinely look at this as a national emergency, and to try and join together with the excellent police work that we have in parts, but to improve and increase that, and then also to bring together the passion which some of our members have for this crucial area, not to lose hope, because that would be giving in, but to redouble our efforts to concentrate on this crucial area of young people and knife violence. Thank you, Mr Davies.
So I'll move to the front bench now. For the SNP, Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Davies. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I thank the petitioners and the Petitions Committee for bringing this very urgent issue before us for attention today, and also thank the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for his very able and comprehensive introduction to the subject, and indeed all Honourable Members for their very thoughtful and thought-provoking speeches today. Like others, I would like to start simply by reflecting on the horror and the personal tragedy that each incident of knife crime represents, and to say that our thoughts and hearts do go out to all who have been impacted, including whole communities such as Havering and Dudley and Hammersmith and Croydon and Wood Green and so many others across the country. This petition and the debates that we may be having tomorrow on the Offensive Weapons Bill asks us where the balance should lie between different policy responses to knife crime, and the petitioners have obviously decided to place their focus on sentencing. And that is entirely understandable, particularly for those who have experienced or been affected by knife crime. And of course there must be proper and appropriate punishment of offenders. And indeed in Scotland, sentencing has indeed been one small part of the response, as the Honourable Member for Romford mentioned earlier. Maximum sentences for possession have been increased to 5 years, and the average length of custodial sentences for knife possession offences have increased too, albeit without introducing mandatory prison sentences, where I share the Honourable Member for Hammersmith's scepticism. But I think the key point is that sentencing policy in Scotland is broadly in the same ballpark as in England and Wales, and I cannot see, and I do not agree, that the upsurge in knife crime that we've seen in too many areas of England and Wales is down to a lack of appropriate sanctions. There is no evidence for that, and as the Honourable Member for Croydon Central said, there is little or no evidence that increasing the length of sentences will have any significant deterrent effect. I share the views of the Honourable Member for Hammersmith here, in that I think we tend to put far too much faith in sentencing and harsh sentences to fix all of society's ills, whereas in reality prison in particular can often cause more problems than it solves, particularly in terms of short sentences. It's too often operates almost as a training camp, as the Honourable Member for Croydon said. So the focus should be on other policy areas, many of which were touched upon during the course of the debate, and which I'll refer briefly to now. Turning to policing levels, of course, policing numbers are also relevant despite the protestations from the Prime Minister. Our honourable members have said that almost unanimously today. Senior officers have said that. And while I'm often reluctant, well, always reluctant to compare possibly apples and oranges, and it can sometimes be a pretty crude way to do things, I was struck to read the other day that in September of 2018 there were roughly 32 officers per 10,000 of the population in Scotland, compared to around 21 officers per 10,000 of the population in England and Wales. So that is a hugely significant difference. There may be other explanations for it, but if I was an MP in England and Wales, I would be asking questions about how that gap has arisen. Members referred to the need for local policing or hotspot policing. All of that is necessary, and we need to see resources invested in it. Turning to austerity and questions of resources more generally, last week we had witnesses before the Home Affairs Committee who quite simply were clear that austerity and cuts to services more generally were having a significant impact. They said that the safe spaces, the youth clubs, the council-funded sports facilities and the sports teams have faced the brunt of these cuts. These are places where young people find diversion and they meet role models, and all of this undoubtedly has an impact. Services such as social work, employability, mental health are all buckling under the strain, and all of that counts in the battle to stem the tide of knife crime. So Davies, some honourable members also referred to stop and search, and I agree that stop and search can play a role. Again, it's of course far from an answer in itself, and it must be used extremely carefully and in a way that doesn't risk undermining trust in the role of the police. It must be done on the basis of reasonable suspicion. Intelligence-led and proportionate were the words that the honourable member for Henley used, and I think he was very wise to do that. Tomorrow or soon we will debate knife crime prevention orders, and we heard some differing views on that subject today. We don't have these in Scotland, and I have to say that based on what I've heard so far, I severely doubt that I would like to see them there. I'm grateful to the honourable member for Croydon Central for all the work that she does with the APPG on knife crime, and for the event that she organised this lunchtime, where we heard from a whole range of actors as to why these knife crime prevention orders appear to be filling a gap which actually doesn't really exist, that it lacks an evidence base, and instead they risk seriously counterproductive and unintended consequences. Putting that aside, more generally, I welcome the provisions in most of the provisions in the Offensive Weapons Bill, but again, it's a small piece of a much bigger picture. So instead, I think it's away from purely criminal justice measures where we can find a significant, or can make a significant and long-term difference, and that is where Scotland has already seen some success, if only because we experienced horrendous levels of violence not so long ago ourselves, which required, of course, an urgent response. And it's important to remember just how bad the position was. As recently as 2005, the UN talked of Scotland as among the most violent countries in the developed world, and the World Health Organisation referred to Glasgow as one of the murder capitals of the world. And while we still have a long way to go, the evidence points to significant success in reducing levels of violence, again, as the Honourable Member for Romford pointed out in his speech. So we've seen, for example, recorded violent crime in Scotland down by 49% over a decade to 2016-2017. The homicide rate has halved over the decade from 2008. Offending by young people halved since 2008, and various other dramatic statistics which show that a long-term approach and a public health approach can make a difference, because while other policies have undoubtedly played a part, including sentencing, I think it is, as we all know in here, that public health approach which has really been responsible for turning the tide. So that approach is about addressing the underlying risk factors that increase the likelihood that people will become a victim or a perpetrator of violence, and it means an evidence-based whole-of-government approach that seeks to tackle the causes of violence rather than just the symptoms. So it's about prevention and early intervention rather than action after tragic events. Members know about the work that the Violence Reduction Unit does, together with organisations and campaigns such as No Knives, Better Lives and Mentors in Violence. On the ground, it's about seeking opportunities to divert from prosecution, community alternatives to secure care and custody, and improving reintegration back into the community. It means improving life chances, promoting school inclusions, strengthening relationships and engagement, building life skills, improving health and well-being, and trying to improve employability. And none of that is new, Mr Davies, and much of it is indeed common sense. And all of it has, in fact, of course, been learned from other cities such as New York and Chicago, and tweaked and toned simply so it could work in Glasgow and other parts of Scotland. So the same can hopefully work over the longer term in parts of England, not just by directly copying what's going on elsewhere, but again learning what works and what can work and tailoring it to local circumstances. And so I welcome, for example, that Mayor Khan has established a violence reduction unit in London. And of course, the UK Government has published its serious violence strategy, and it includes a move towards a public health approach. Whether that is a modest change of emphasis or a full-scale rethink, only time will tell. But to save lives, it should be a genuine and cross-government commitment to pursue that approach with the funds that are needed made available. So, in concluding, Mr Davies, I just want to emphasise and support what the Honourable Member for Gedling said when he raised what seemed to be almost a lack of urgency in the response to this national crisis or epidemic, as honourable members have spoken about. I mean, this has been going on and getting worse for the best part of 2 years, but until now the response has largely been local and operational rather than strategic and at a national level. So if it's not COBRA, then absolutely it has to be another type of serious cross-government coordination. This needs national direction and it needs it urgently.
Thank you. Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr Davies. It is, of course, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, sir. Can I also begin by thanking the petitioners and the Petition Committee, my honourable friend, the member for Hartlepool, in opening this debate today and making some very important points, but also along with the honourable member for Romford, setting what I feel a very measured tone across the floor today and on all the benches, and rightly so. I do believe there are some broader political points that need ironing out, but perhaps today is not the day for that. I will make brief references, but I've, in light of what he said, altered huge parts of my speech because I do think he does make a good point in terms of that. And can I also join many of my honourable friends in firstly remembering some of the tragic, all of the tragic victims of knife crime, those that have been mentioned by honourable members and those that haven't been mentioned here today, but also what we remember. Of course, I will give way.
I'm very grateful. On that point, it's remiss of me not to mention the two young people from Sunderland who were also victims. In the North East, we don't have an epidemic of knife crime. There is a regional element to this, but nonetheless, 31-year-old father Gavin Moon from my constituency was a victim, as was 18-year-old Connor Brown from the neighbouring constituency of Sunderland Central. So whilst we're, the honourable gentleman was naming some of the people who have been victims, I thought I should mention this. This has been an excellent debate, and I didn't intend to stay for long, but it has been so good. I've stayed for the wind-ups. So thank you.
Of course, and I join the honourable lady in remembering those that she refers to and all those others. And our thoughts and hearts do go out to the grieving families. I mean, these are tragedies beyond words for us here today. And also, actually, some of the moving accounts that we have heard from honourable members who make reference to their own individual constituencies, from communities coming together to deal with these issues, to the broader impact on and trauma that sometimes isn't actually acknowledged as much on broader society as a whole and communities. All of these things do happen in the aftermath and sometimes are not given as much thought as they should be. Mr Davies, I also want to thank all honourable members for valuable contributions across the House. The rise in knife crime and the number of young people that have been killed is an issue that should keep us all awake at night. This is a deeply complex issue, and whilst we support robust sentencing, and my honourable friend, the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on knife crime, the member for Croydon Central, I believe, made some real pertinent and persuasive points around sentencing, and I do not wish to repeat all of those, but I believe she set a real tone in terms of the broader impacts with some hard facts. In particular, she made reference to record numbers of offenders sentenced for knife crime and more people given an immediate custodial sentence. But she rightly points out that we must realise that we cannot achieve lower levels of crime through sentencing alone. We need an approach that is rooted in effectiveness, because only then can we begin to stop the rise in violent crime. In taking this approach, we need to understand just what is driving knife crime. And whilst there is little consensus, as we've seen here today, on what has been the trigger for this marked increase in knife crime, the drivers, the issues that have created the conditions in which this epidemic has been able to grow are difficult to dispute. The clearest is that with such a dramatic rise in knife crime, young people are now more scared than ever of becoming victims themselves. They've seen friends wounded or killed and fear the same happening to them. They even feel ignored by authorities when they raise this fear, particularly as those who are most likely to be victims live in high-crime neighbourhoods where police are seen as unable to protect them sometimes, which is compounded by a rise in violence, but a fall in the proportion of crimes where an offender is actually identified. Police officer numbers have been slashed, and it's been mentioned earlier on. That's a fact that we can't move away from. 20,000 police officers fewer since 2010, and vital community police officers who are so important for building community support police officers, for building those relations, also lost. At the same time, we've seen serious issues in our schools, with interventions for vulnerable children being cut as schools face significant funding pressures and a marked increase in exclusions and illegal off-rolling at schools. We already know that vulnerable children are more likely to be off-rolled and excluded, and the Children's Commission has reported a link between exclusions and involvement in gangs, with those excluded 200 times more likely to be involved in gangs, demonstrating that we simply cannot ignore the correlation between rising exclusions and rising knife crime. We have also seen huge reductions in actual services available for young people. And again, I'm not making politics of it. This is just the hard facts of where we are. We've seen 3,500 youth service jobs lost, closure of 600 centres, 130,000 places lost. We've seen sweeping cuts to education, teachers lost. We've seen the loss of other vital early intervention services as councils face unprecedented cuts. And we've seen youth offending budgets cut by half, curbing intervention and degrading services that help prevent young people from becoming victims and offenders in the first place. These are all services that assist those who are already disaffected and vulnerable. And it's no coincidence that victims and offenders are from areas of huge social disadvantage. Mr Davies, we cannot address these issues these drivers are offending with more sentencing alone. We can only address them with an interdepartmental approach, because sentencing is a downstream solution that is applied when it is already too late. What we need is an upstream solution that identifies the root causes of crime and brings together organisations right across central government, local government, the police and the community sector, a solution that is built on public health, a public health approach that's been referred to by many members and actually is something that is well documented, an approach that collects data, identifies the factors at play, implements solutions and rolls out those that work. What this solution calls for more broadly is stimulation of housing, employment opportunities and community facilities, as the Association of Directors of Children's Services suggest, an investment in young people who overwhelmingly are those who are most affected, and a cross-departmental approach like we have seen at the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland that a number of members have made reference to also, where partners in the NHS, education and social work cooperate closely together, which helps give young people the future they deserve and lifts them out of the dire situations they find themselves in, situations that all too often lead to them falling into a life of crime. This is also an approach that is far from being soft on crime. It is an approach that does get results, as the Honourable Member, the spokesperson for the SNP, referred to. And that approach in Scotland met with considerable success, with numbers of homicides halving between 2004-05 and 2016-17, leading to calls for its implementation in England by the Youth Violence Commission, the Home Affairs Committee and the head of Scotland Yard. Even the Home Secretary has said that we need to treat knife crime as a disease. Unfortunately, he's only offered to tackle the symptoms of knife crime, stabbings and possession, not the causes. We need to do more than this. We need to shift the whole model and move our focus away from purely specific interventions for high-risk individuals to cast the net wider, to focus on low and medium-risk offenders, where most of the cases arise from, avoiding a prevention paradox. And we need to see a joint ownership of the problems that lead to knife crime, because they don't just lie with the police, and I think we've got to be really clear in our approach about that. Ultimately, we need to recognise, Mr Davies, and adopt an approach that sees violence as preventable, not inevitable, and we need a meaningful public health approach that can address knife crime and its causes.
Thank you. Minister Rory Stewart to respond.
Well, thank you, Mr Davies. It's a great pleasure to share under your chairmanship. I want to begin by paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for bringing this debate. Pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Bradford East for the compassion and the empathy with which he began his speech, and indeed reflect on the way in which all members, over a debate that has lasted now 2.5 hours, have committed to this issue, and the enormous amount that I personally have learned as a Justice Minister from many, many different dimensions. Particular tribute to my friend, the Honourable Member for Romford, for the extraordinary passion with which he brings his attention to bear on the question of victims in his own area. And actually the Right Honourable Member for Gedling, who is a real firecracker. That was a great speech, and it was a huge amount of energy and passion, and I'm sure he's right. The only way that these kinds of issues can ever be gripped is exactly in the way that he described. I pick up very much the sense of frustration around the room, and indeed the situation is very, very disturbing, and it has been getting steadily worse, and I can completely understand why people feel infuriated, frustrated, and want more action more quickly. To reassure people on individual questions, the Prime Minister will be holding her summit in Chequers next week. In the Prime Minister's defence, there is a reason why over the last 2 weeks she's found it difficult to organise the meeting in Chequers. That isn't because Brexit is stopping everything else that's happening in government, but it is that Brexit is stopping many of the other things that might otherwise have been happening in the Prime Minister's diary. But she will be doing that next week. In terms of gripping it, we have now set up an interministerial group on serious violence, which now meets regularly, chaired by the Home Secretary. I'm a member of that group, and we are making a lot of rapid progress. But as the Right Honourable Member for Gedling implies, that kind of Cobra-style approach is vital for bringing everybody together. And at the bottom of all of this needs to be the fact that as we think about this problem, we need to be realistic. We need, above all, to be practical. Any number, in fact, probably 200 or 300 different ideas are contained within the serious violence strategy produced by the government. All of them are good. All of them make a difference. Yeah.
Just an interesting point that knife crime orders are not part of that strategy, and a lot of the organisations that have talked to me about the prevention orders say that they suspect it was a sort of knee-jerk thing in part to show that they're acting, and that actually they were never part of the strategy which the Minister is talking about, and which is very comprehensive in its diagnosis, if not solution.
Okay. So, Davies, I'll come back to this question of knife crime prevention laws, because, of course, actually the interesting thing about this debate is that although we all share a horror of knife crime, not everybody in this room agrees about the particulars. Not everybody agrees about knife crime prevention orders. Not everybody agrees about how long sentences should be. Not everybody agrees about how much more people should be sent. Not everybody agrees on whether the court should have discretion or not have discretion. So, in a sense, what we have in this chamber is a reflection of the kind of debates that operate within the public. And I'll try to come back specifically to knife crime prevention orders. But at the core of it is the question of which one of the dozens of suggestions within the strategy is going to make the most difference as quickly as possible, and which of them is most effective, right? So there may be many different individual initiatives which could be fantastically good at a community level, but there may be others which are better, and we really need to focus on that. And in particular, I want to focus on 4 areas. The first, of course, is the issue of sentencing itself. This is a debate about sentencing, and I'm really here as a representative of the Ministry of Justice to talk about sentencing. It is true that following on the 2015 two-strike rule, more people are now going to jail for knife possession offences, and they are going to jail for longer. The Honourable Member for Hornchurch and Upminster has raised the question of whether we have got that balance right. It is a difficult balance. The Honourable Member for Gedling asked, and a very experienced ex-police minister, exactly how these exceptions are defined. They are defined quite closely. So 82% of people found in a double possession will find their way towards a sentence. Who are those 18% who are not getting sentences? The guidelines stipulate very clearly what the mitigating factors are and lay them out. So, for example, in extreme cases, and I'll give way to the Right Honourable Member in a second, but in extreme cases, it could be somebody with learning difficulties, somebody with mental health problems, somebody with a serious medical problem, somebody who has cooperated with the police. All of these things are mitigating factors which may lead to somebody not receiving such a sentence. Right?
Could the Minister just inform us here? When he talks about 82% of people are given a sentence by the court, does he mean suspended sentences as well as custodial sentences?
I'm including suspended sentences as well as immediate custodial sentences. But, of course, in the case of a suspended sentence, if somebody then breaks the licence conditions, they then will be recalled to court for the remainder of their custodial sentence.
What proportion of the 82% get suspended sentences, and what proportion receive immediate custodial sentences?
Approximately 22% of the cohort do not receive a full custodial sentence out of that 82%. And all of that then goes to the core of what the mitigating and aggravating factors in the judge's hands are. And as the Right Honourable Member for Gedling has pointed out, this is absolutely standard in any legislation that we bring forward, which is we leave some discretion for the judges. One of the questions at the core of this is, of course, the question which has been raised again and again by the Honourable Member for Croydon Central and indeed the Honourable Member for Battersea around the issue of deterrence. In order to be practical, we need to focus on the fact that the main thing that the evidence suggests makes a difference to somebody who is considering committing a crime is their chance of being caught. Whether they receive a 6-month sentence, a 9-month sentence, or a 12-month sentence, or even a 5-year sentence, is much less likely to motivate their behaviour than the chance of being caught. So take an example in burglary. It is almost certainly the very low rate of conviction rather than the length of sentence which is making a difference. If you feel you have a 3% chance of being caught, it doesn't really matter how long the sentence is, which is why most of our focus now is going into putting another £100 million behind the police to focus on knife rather than increasing this form of sentence length. There is another argument, though, on why, in response to the particular suggestions here of a 25-year sentence for using a knife and a 10-year sentence for possessing a knife, we have to be cautious, which is that any sentencing needs to balance with other forms of sentencing, or victims and victims' families will feel that justice has not been done. What do I mean by that? If you get a 25-year sentence for using a knife in any way, cutting somebody with a knife, and at the same time, currently, the minimum custodial sentence for murder is 15 years, it will be very, very understandable that a family will look at somebody getting 15 years for murder and wonder why somebody else is getting 25 years for using a knife. The same would be true if you got 25 years for using a knife and 25 years for killing someone with a knife, right, which is what's implied by this suggestion. A family would very understandably say, how come this person's getting 25 years for using a knife to wound, and here's another person getting 25 years for murdering with a knife? And the reason for that is that it's a fundamental principle of our law that we look at the consequence of the crime and the culpability of the criminal. We do not look at the weapon used, right? We don't determine whether somebody used a crossbow, a gun, or a knife. What we look at is, was it murder? Was it grievous bodily harm? What form of offence was committed? And this is really important. If we start introducing offences which are based purely on the type of weapon that's used, we will end up with injustice being felt all the way through our legal system. Doesn't mean that we can't look at sentencing, but this particular proposal doesn't make sense. Again, on the 10 years. If you were to get 10 years for possessing a knife, currently at the moment, the minimum sentence for possessing a firearm is 5 years. The public would feel a deep, deep injustice if someone were to get 10 years for a knife and 5 years for a firearm. It simply doesn't make sense. So in thinking about sentencing, we cannot just think about one type of offence. We have to think about the effect on the whole system. Now, moving onwards very quickly, because I'm aware that, Ms Davis, we've trespassed on your patience for a very long time. I wanted to move through early intervention and prevention. I wanted to move through supporting communities, and then I wanted to talk about effective law enforcement, which are the three central planks of any response to knife crime. Firstly, early intervention and protection. Here, the Honourable Member for Washington and Sunderland, and indeed the Honourable Member for Croydon Central, have made very eloquent interventions and speeches. It is very clear that if we are serious about tackling knife crime, and indeed I want to pay tribute here to the Honourable Member for Cumbernauld for a very modest, a very charming speech, given Scotland's extraordinary success in this area. It was I thought it was a very intelligent speech, seeing that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, seeing that we can learn from Scotland without replicating, and I want to pay tribute both to what Scotland's done and the spirit with which you've approached this debate. Clearly, we have to look at risk factors, and the key risk factors in an individual who is involved in knife crime are the individual themselves, and that could be, as indeed the Honourable Member for the Rhondda has pointed out, things such as acquired brain injury. It could be neglect and abuse in the home. The second factor is the family context. 47% of people committing homicides in a recent study had been in care. 47% of murderers. That's almost half of them had been in care. So the family context is central. Thirdly, the community context within which people operate. Deprived neighbourhoods are, of course, much more likely to lead to somebody committing a knife crime. Then the school that they attend, Really important. If an individual has been caught up in bullying in school, if an individual has been playing truant from school, these are very, very serious risk factors, and we need to do more to work with schools. Schools are quite good at picking up on children who are victims of domestic abuse. Are they good enough at identifying people who are being sucked into knife crime? Should we, in fact, be working with Ofsted to try to work on assessing schools on how good they are at identifying people being sucked into knife crime? And finally, of course, their peer group, the people that they spend their time with, are the fifth biggest risk factor in determining whether or not somebody gets sucked into knife crime. In order to respond to that, we can respond, right? This isn't just touchy-feely nonsense. We can prove that a targeted approach, not a universal approach, so again, this is about being really smart with public money. The answer isn't to lecture every child in the country on knife crime, but to make sure that we target those who are most at risk with the most serious support. So, bringing in a therapist with a caseload of 5 or 6 children, going into a family once a week, making sure that you spend the time with them, can reduce the likelihood of that child going on to commit a violent offence by 25%. That one thing, 25%. Huge difference. And we begin building these different things up, and we can really begin to address some of the underlying causes of knife crime. Supporting communities. Here, of course, the Honourable Member for Cumbernauld has been very eloquent. We need a mapper-style approach, and this is something, again, which the Honourable Member for Gedling has referred to. We need to think about comms. We need to think about how we get a proper media approach. We need to think about how that could be a digital media approach, how we actually communicate to people the dangers of knife crimes. We need to think about what we do with retailers who sell knives. That also involves bringing in trading standards. I mean, if we were going to wrap up different bits of government, we need trading standards to try to buy knives online as under 18-year-olds, go into shops, even small retailers, and try to buy knives as under 18-year-olds, and then report back to the retailer if somebody on the shop floor has sold a knife to somebody who is underage. We need to think about victim support, which was the point made by the Honourable Member for Hornsey and Wood Green. The answer to the specific question is that anybody who witnessed that attack is entitled to victim support. They do not need to be related. A witness is entitled to victim support. I'm very pleased that you champion that issue, and I'm very happy to give way.
For giving way, would he agree with me that victim support is inconsistent? In some places very good, in others not so good, and what measures is the government putting in place to monitor where it's not good, and what is the government doing about it?
The answer is that we have just published a victim strategy. We're investing more and more in victim support, over £90 million a year, and this is part of a broader spectrum of support. So we've got £200 million now going into Youth Endowment Fund, which is directly driven by this strategy and responding exactly to the public health approach which has been pioneered in Scotland. We've got another £22 million going into an early intervention fund, right, which is responding to the stuff that we're talking about in relation to schools and families. But that brings us to effective law enforcement, where my great friend, the Honourable Member for Romford, is pushing us. He's got a very interesting point, I think, about community policing and the way in which community policing does or does not overlap with particular ward boundaries. The Honourable Member for Hammersmith actually also spoke in some detail about community policing, but we need to balance that with stuff that is very, very specific on knife crime. So very specific on knife crime means making sure there are plainclothes officers there in the hotspot areas. Hotspot areas central. Hotspot areas central because in Peterborough we discovered taking a hotspot approach, getting the right data, finding where the problems are coming from, reduced violence by 37%. 37% without displacing it to any other area, right? Hotspot policing central, yep.
He's making a very thoughtful speech, and while we won't agree on everything, I'm sure he's talking a lot of sense. Just to say, Croydon's just looked at this piece of work that's been done, and there are 10 areas in Croydon where most violence outside occurs, and it's by the kind of supermarkets, it's in the places you would kind of think it is, and you're absolutely, the Minister is absolutely right that actually targeting those areas with effective policing would be an incredibly sensible way to spend public money.
Well, I'm very grateful for that. So the answer, I think, to everyone in the room who've raised the issues of law enforcement is yes, community policing plays a part, but actually what happens with the Violent Crime Task Force is a 10 a.m. meeting every day in Lambeth where they get the intelligence on the previous 12 hours of where people have gathered, where the weapons are moving, and then they target their intervention for that day. They have their own team of uniformed officers who back up the plainclothes officers on the ground, and they go in. They do a weapons sweep. They do a community weapons sweep. They use a Section 1 order to go after an individual. They use a Section 60 order to go after a geographical area. They go after habitual knife carriers. They conduct searches with search warrants based on drug suspicion in houses. By doing this, and through Operation Sceptre, where we get 42 different police forces across the country doing this at the same time for week periods, we are able to get astonishing quantities of knives hoovered up. But the real key in that is the community part. The real key in that is the community part, because the community sweep, where the local community leader or the head of the local boxing club or somebody who actually wants to speak for the community is out there doing that community sweep, finding the knives in the hedges, finding the knives concealed in the cars, makes far more difference than the police officers just doing it on their own. Yeah.
Minister, could let me know, in light of those kinds of activities in boroughs like Lambeth, do you see any displacement activity? So do you see people move into neighbouring boroughs, or actually do you see that have a real impact on knife crime over a much wider area?
No, the experience actually, strangely, has been that there hasn't been a displacement activity, and we've looked at this very carefully. It actually seems that by targeting those areas, you grab it in those areas and you don't push it onto those other neighbouring areas. There are different theories on those. One of them is that some of this is quite gang-related, and some of those gangs are quite geographically limited, so that you're not likely to displace it to another area. But at the core of all of this is crack cocaine. Right? Very, very sadly, we are talking about innocent victims, people who have nothing to do with crack cocaine, but the core driving this is crack cocaine and crack cocaine gangs. And although drug use in general is coming down, crack cocaine use is going up. Over a single year period, 16-17, 17-18, crack cocaine use up 18%. And county lines, which is an incredibly important part of this, is also contributing to this. These are the same gangs. And that means that we have to get on top of mobile phones, so we've had to bring in new ways of intercepting the mobile phones, which are so central to the way that the county lines gangs operate. We've had to set up a new NCA task force to focus on county lines, and we're having to be much smarter about data. In partial response to the Honourable Member for Henley, who made a very good speech on this, one of the things we're learning is that our data just hasn't been good enough. For example, we have not been coding knife crimes properly. So actually setting up smart software that allows us to pick out something that's simply registered as GBH as actually being a knife crime makes a huge difference to our ability to actually target these hotspot areas. Now, that is about all this stuff that we've been talking about so far, is preventing from early childhood onwards somebody being dragged into these gangs. Then it is the Violent Crime Task Force moving into an area to try to make sure that if somebody picks up a knife, we get them as soon as possible, and we get them particularly on possession. Then, God forbid, somebody actually is convicted or uses a knife, then we're moving on to the question of what happens in the courts, what happens in the prisons, and what happens in probation. And there, too, we have to look at all these other issues. We have to take on board the fact that the real protection for the public is making sure that the person who has offended once doesn't re-offend. Now, on knife crime, we are doing statistically a bit better than with other crimes. So generally, short-term offenders are re-offending at a rate of nearly 60%. Knife crime offenders are re-offending at about half that rate. But still, half that rate is still too high. So we need to be addressing addiction issues. We need to be getting them jobs. We need to be helping them into employment and into accommodation. Yeah.
I thank the Minister for giving way a second time. And would he agree with me that currently the approach to drug rehabilitation services in prison is not robust enough, and not enough people are getting access to those crucial treatments and being cured of drug and alcohol issues?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. We should do much, much more on addiction. In fact, it's very striking. For example, in shoplifting, It's a big, big problem. We have a lot of shoplifting. It's the majority of people getting sentences, short sentences under 6 months. The highest number of single offence is shoplifting by a very, very large margin. Of those, 76% are crack cocaine or heroin addicts. The real way of dealing with that is to deal with their crack cocaine or heroin addiction. Honourable Member. Yeah.
Just ask the Minister this question. So he's given a very thoughtful, measured and informed response. So the people listening to this and listening to his response will go, that's great. How's the government and Parliament going to make that happen? And as part of that, will the Minister say to this committee, Mr Davis, if he'll go back, wake some of the people up who need waking up, and get some regular statements to Parliament every single week at the least about what is happening, what progress is being made, and what is or isn't being done. And can that be a statement, and not because somebody asks an urgent question? It should be a regular statement to Parliament on this.
Thank you. Look, I have enormous admiration for the Right Honourable Member for Gedling, and I would be very proud to have him as part of our team dealing with this. I'm sure he'd deal with it very well. I'm not in the business of committing colleagues in the Home Office to their business of making statements. But I can assure him we are taking this very seriously. I haven't spoken enough to the Honourable Member for Dudley North, but one of the answers to him is that we are, of course, putting another £100 million into policing, particularly driven by violent crime and knife crime, in addition to the investment in the Youth Endowment Fund. And in terms of action, it isn't just what happens in Parliament. It isn't just the interministerial group that's been set up. It's not just the meeting that the Prime Minister is holding next week. It's actually setting up the Violent Crime Task Force, setting up that 10 a.m. meeting every morning in Lambeth, making sure that the money and the resources are beginning to flow behind this. I believe this will make a significant difference, but I absolutely agree to sit down with the Right Honourable Member for Gedling that the only way of doing this, or anything in government, is urgency, grip, imagination, passion, and above all, something rooted in realism. And on that, thank you very, very much indeed to the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for an incredibly informative debate.
Thank you. Mike Hill to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Davis. I thank the members from Romford, Gedling, Hornchurch and Upminster, Dudley North, Henley, Hammersmith, Croydon Central, Hornsey and Wood Green for contributing to this important debate, and the number of people who made important interventions, not least the member for Washington and Sunderland West, and of course the front bench representatives who all made incredible contributions to this very important debate. I'm sure, Mr Davis, there would have been many, many more people in this room were it not for what's happening in the chamber. However, the subject areas that were covered were important and diverse, talking about deterrent, prevention and cause and effect, as well as addressing the sentencing element of the petition. But I couldn't end this debate without paying homage to one of our own, PC Keith Palmer, who was a victim of knife crime a couple of yards outside of this very building. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 233926 relating to knife crime. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.